My husband George was a good man. The nurses here at the Chestnut Ridge facility all said so when he passed last year. They'd bring me my meals with sympathetic, downturned lips and tell me what a kind soul he was, how he always had a gentle word for them, how he never failed to ask about their children. They brought me cards filled with watercolor flowers and scripted condolences from people I barely knew, other residents' families who'd seen us sitting together in the common room, him reading his newspaper and me with my knitting. They all said he was at peace now. They all said I was brave. I accepted their words like a well-worn coat, something to wrap around the chill they couldn't possibly understand. I nodded and offered faint, watery smiles. I was a convincing portrait of a grieving widow. But I didn't cry at his funeral, not a single tear. I sat on the hard, polished wood of the front pew, staring at the mahogany casket draped in lilies, and felt nothing but a profound and terrifying hollowness. It wasn't a lack of love that kept my eyes dry. I had loved George, in my own quiet, fractured way. I cried for a different reason, a reason that had been buried alive for nearly half a century. I cried because for the 45 years we'd been married, the 45 years he had known me as Anna Peterson, I had never once been allowed to be myself. And with him gone, the silence I had mistaken for peace was finally over. The ghost I had spent a lifetime trying to outrun had finally stopped to wait for me. In the year since his passing, the ghost has become a constant companion. It sits with me in this small, beige room, its presence more real than the cheerful, rotating art prints the facility hangs on the walls. The room is sparse, a testament to a life lived without collecting much. George wasn't a man for clutter, and I was a woman with no past to display. There is a bed, a dresser, and this simple armchair by the window, where the afternoon sun streams in and illuminates the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, forgotten memories. The air is thick with the scent of lavender-scented disinfectant and the quiet hum of the building's circulation. And above it all, the ticking of the clock on my bedside table, tick-tock. Each sound is a tiny hammer, chipping away at the years I have left, a steady, unforgiving metronome counting down to an end I no longer fear. For so long, that sound was a comfort, a rhythm of the quiet life George had given me. Now, it feels like a taunt. George loved the woman he called Anna. He loved her quiet nature, her diligence. He loved that she never asked for much, that she seemed content with the simple life he provided in a small, forgettable town, hundreds of miles from anywhere that mattered. He loved a woman I invented, a careful construct of half-truths and omissions. He never knew the girl I had been, the one whose real name was choked out of her, whose story was a festering wound I covered with the clean, white bandage of a new identity. Protecting him from that wound became my life's work. It was my penance and my prison. As long as he was alive, the ghost had to remain chained in the cellar of my memory. But now he is gone. The reason for my silence is buried under 6 feet of earth, and the ghost is rattling its chains. It demands to be heard. There is a photograph on my bedside table, next to the ticking clock and a glass of water. For the past year, it has been turned face down. A small 5x7 frame of dark, polished wood. The staff probably assume it's a picture of George, a memory too painful to face. They are wrong. It is a memory far more painful than grief. It is the genesis of all my sorrows. My hand, a web of raised veins and paper-thin skin, trembles as I reach for it. The movement is slow, agonizing, as if lifting a great weight. My fingers brush against the cool glass. For a moment, I hesitate. To turn it over is to begin. To begin is to unravel everything, to pull the single thread that will bring the whole tapestry of my life crashing down into a pile of lies. But the ticking of the clock urges me on, tick-tock. There is not much time left. With a final, shuddering breath, I turn the photograph over. It's not a picture of George. It's in black and white, faded to shades of gray and sepia by the passage of time. A family portrait from an era of pristine lawns and hidden truths. 4 figures, posed stiffly against a sterile studio backdrop. The Millers, my family. Staring out from the past, they are frozen in their designated roles, a perfect tableau of everything that was wrong with my world. It all started in a town called Havenwood, nestled in a green valley in Oregon. The name itself was a lie, a poetic flourish for a place that was anything but a haven for someone like me. To the outside world, Havenwood was idyllic. A place of community potlucks, 4th of July parades, and unquestioning respect for its leading citizens. And at the very top of that hierarchy were the Millers. Dr. Miller's family. That name, our name, was like a crown, a heavy, ornate thing that demanded to be kept polished at all times. My father wore it as if he were born to it. My brother was its heir apparent, already practicing its weight. My mother spent her entire life in terror of tarnishing it. And me? I was just a shadow in the background, a silent servant tasked with holding it up for the others to wear. But shadows see everything. They linger in corners, they listen at doors, they observe the flickers of truth that are invisible in the bright glare of the public eye. My gaze drifts across the photograph, examining the ghosts one by one. There at the center is my father, Dr. Richard Miller. Even in the faded image, his authority is absolute. He isn't sitting, he's presiding. His suit is immaculate, his posture ramrod straight. The light catches the glint of his spectacles, obscuring his eyes, but I don't need to see them to know their cold, assessing glare. That was his power. He could dissect a person with a single look, identify their weaknesses, and file them away for later use. I remember the smell of antiseptic that clung to him, a sterile scent that seemed to emanate from his very pores, as if he was constantly trying to scrub the messiness of human emotion from the world. His love wasn't a warmth, it was an expectation of perfection. His disappointment wasn't loud. It was a soul-crushing, silent withdrawal that could make you feel like you had ceased to exist. In the photo, his hand rests on my brother's shoulder, a gesture not of affection, but of ownership. Next to him stands my mother, Eleanor. A wisp of a woman, pretty in a faded, anxious way. Her smile in the photograph is a masterpiece of tension, a careful arrangement of muscles that doesn't reach her eyes. Her eyes, even in this old picture, are filled with a familiar, helpless panic. She is looking at the camera, but her attention feels directed inward, consumed by a constant, humming anxiety. She lived her life walking on eggshells, her primary function to be a buffer between my father's temper and the world, to manage his moods, to anticipate his needs. Her betrayal wasn't an act, it was a state of being. It was in her determined blindness, her refusal to see what was happening right in front of her. Her love was a nervous apology, a plea for quiet, a constant prayer that today would not be the day the carefully constructed facade finally cracked. And then there is Jacob. My brother, the golden boy. He stands tall and proud, a half-smile playing on his lips. The camera loved him. Everyone loved him. He had our father's ambition, but masked it with a disarming charm our mother could only dream of. He was the star quarterback, the straight-A student, the boy every girl wanted and every parent held up as an example. In the photograph, he looks directly at the lens, his confidence so bright it almost hurts to look at. He is the sun around which our family solar system revolved. But I, the shadow, saw what others did not. I saw the flash of cruelty in his eyes when a younger child fumbled a ball. I saw the cold, calculating way he could manipulate our parents, twisting situations to his advantage with effortless skill. I saw the darkness that lurked beneath the brilliant shine, the possessive glint that was reserved only for me. His hand in the photo is not touching anyone. It's curled into a loose fist at his side, brimming with a contained energy, a power he was just learning to wield. Finally, my eyes fall on the last figure. The girl, me. I am almost hidden, positioned slightly behind my father, one shoulder obscured by his frame. I am 16 years old, but I look younger, smaller, as if I am physically shrinking to take up less space. My dress, chosen by my mother, is a plain, forgettable thing. My hair is pulled back severely. I am looking at the camera, but my gaze is not direct like Jacob's. It's a haunted, sidelong glance. The photographer probably told me to smile, and I can see the pathetic attempt, a slight upward twitch at the corner of my mouth that is instantly negated by the stark terror in my eyes. It's that look that holds me now. The old woman in the armchair staring at the terrified girl in the photograph. I remember that day. I remember the scratchy fabric of the dress and the heat of the studio lights. I remember the photographer's booming, cheerful voice and the way it grated on my raw nerves. And I remember the precise, bone-deep fear that was my constant companion. It wasn't the abstract anxiety of a teenager. It was the specific, visceral terror of a hunted animal that knows the predator lives inside its own den. Looking at this girl, this ghost of who I was, I feel a surge of something that isn't pity. It's rage. A cold, ancient rage that has been sleeping for decades. Rage for the voice she was never allowed to have. Rage for the innocence that was stolen from her, not by a stranger in the dark, but by the smiling golden boy standing right next to her. Rage for the man and woman who posed as her protectors while they orchestrated her destruction. They thought they had buried that girl. They gave her a new name, a new life, and sealed her past in a tomb of shame and silence. They thought they had won, but the past doesn't die. It doesn't even fade. It just lies in wait, in the shadows of a quiet room, in the face of a photograph, waiting for the ticking of a clock to finally grant it permission to speak. And I, the old woman who survived, will now give that terrified girl her voice. I will tell her story, my story. And the perfect world of the Millers of Havenwood will burn to the ground. The house on Sycamore Lane was a testament to my father's ambition. It wasn't the largest in Havenwood, but it was, by all accounts, the most perfect. A 2-story colonial with crisp white siding and shutters painted a deep, authoritative black. In the spring, my mother's prize-winning roses climbed the trellis by the porch, their blooms a riot of controlled color. In the summer, the lawn was a carpet of impossibly green, meticulously cross-hatched grass that my father inspected with the same critical eye he used for surgical sutures. There was never a leaf out of place, never a weed bold enough to sprout. The house stood as a silent, gleaming statement. This is the home of Dr. Richard Miller. Here, there is order. Here, there is control. It was inside those walls that I learned the true meaning of silence. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the air you breathed, the space between words, the careful, measured tread of footsteps on the polished hardwood floors. It was the palpable tension that hummed beneath the surface of our lives, a constant, low-grade current of anxiety that originated from my father's study and permeated every room. We were all actors in a play he directed, and our primary role was to never, ever miss a cue. My stage, most afternoons, was the kitchen. It was a bright, modern room with gleaming chrome appliances and cheerful yellow countertops my mother had chosen in a rare moment of asserting her own taste, a choice she later came to regret, as my father often remarked that the color was frivolous. It was here that my mother, Eleanor, performed her most frantic scenes. She would flit about the space, a hummingbird of nervous energy, her hands never still. Wiping an already spotless counter, adjusting the flame on the stove by a millimeter, her movements were quick, jerky, a physical manifestation of her inner turmoil. I remember one particular afternoon, the air thick with the promise of an autumn evening. The scent of roasting chicken and rosemary filled the kitchen, a comforting aroma that was completely at odds with the atmosphere. I was 16, moving with the practiced invisibility I had perfected over the years. My task was to set the dining room table, a ritual of precision. The fork, the knife, the spoon, each placed exactly 1 inch from the edge of the placemat. The water glass precisely at the tip of the knife. Any deviation would be noticed. My movements were fluid, silent. I was a ghost in my own home, a skill learned for survival. My mother was humming, a thin, reedy sound that was more a release of nervous energy than a melody. "Jacob will be home any minute," she said to no one in particular, her back to me as she basted the chicken. "I hope he's hungry. Winning games must be exhausting work." Her voice was filled with a reverence, usually reserved for prayer. Just then, the back door swung open, and he was there. My brother. Jacob entered the kitchen, not like a boy coming home from school, but like a king returning to his court. He dropped his bag of books on the floor with a heavy thud that made our mother jump and tossed a scuffed football into the air, catching it with an easy grace. He was 18, at the peak of his physical prowess, his face flushed with health and victory. He was handsome, and he knew it. His smile, when he turned it on our mother, could have lit the room. "Starving, Mom," he said, his voice a rich baritone. "Coach worked us like dogs today. Said the scouts from the university were in the stands." Eleanor turned, her face illuminated with adoration. "Oh, Jacob, I'm sure you were wonderful. The best one on the field, I have no doubt." "Of course," he said, the statement casual, factual. "The team would fall apart without me." He moved then, striding across the linoleum floor towards the hallway. His path took him directly behind me, where I stood placing the last napkin in its silver ring. I felt the air shift as he approached, a change in pressure, a familiar prickle of dread on my skin. I kept my eyes down, focused on the crisp fold of the napkin, praying he would just pass by. He didn't. His hand came to rest on the small of my back. It wasn't a bump, not an accidental brush. It was a deliberate, possessive placement. His fingers were warm through the thin cotton of my blouse, and they pressed, just for a second, into the delicate bones of my spine. The touch was proprietary, a silent assertion of ownership that no one else in the world would ever see or understand. A jolt, hot and vile, shot through me, a current of pure revulsion. My entire body went rigid. The napkin in my hands crumpled, my breath hitched in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate, silent plea for him to move, to take his hand away. It was a universe of violation contained in a single, 2-second touch. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. He continued walking into the hall, his footsteps echoing, leaving me frozen in place. I could feel the phantom heat of his hand on my back, a brand only I could feel. I forced my fingers to uncurl, to smooth the wrinkled napkin. I took a slow, shaky breath and placed it by the plate, my movements stiff, robotic. When I turned, my mother was still beaming at the empty doorway through which her golden son had departed. She hadn't noticed a thing, or, perhaps, she had chosen not to. That was a question I would ask myself for the rest of my life. Dinner at the Miller house was a sacred, silent affair. The dining room was my father's domain, a formal, imposing space with a heavy mahogany table that was always polished to a mirror shine. We sat in our assigned seats, the silence broken only by the delicate clinking of silver against porcelain and the rustle of paper as my father perused his medical journals, which he read throughout the meal. Conversation was not encouraged unless initiated by him. It rarely was. On that particular evening, the tension was a physical presence at the table. It sat beside me, cold and heavy. I could feel Jacob's eyes on me from across the table, a smug, knowing look that I refused to meet. I focused on my plate, on pushing a single green bean around with my fork, my appetite having vanished hours before. My mother ate in tiny bird-like bites, her gaze darting nervously between her husband and her plate. Finally, my father folded his journal and placed it precisely beside his plate. The small sound made us all flinch. He cleared his throat and his eyes, a pale, piercing blue, scanned the table. They passed over my mother's anxious face without pause. They slid right over me, as if my chair were empty, a complete and utter dismissal that was somehow more painful than scorn. Then his gaze settled on Jacob, and it was as if a light had been switched on. "Jacob," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The official scholarship offer from the university came in today. It's a full ride. Their letter stated they expect great things from you on the field and in their pre-med program." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Do not disappoint me." It was not a word of praise or congratulations. It was a command, a declaration of the stakes. My brother's future was not his own. It was an extension of my father's legacy, another brick in the dynasty he was building. Jacob met our father's gaze without flinching. His expression was serious, respectful. The charming boy from the kitchen was gone, replaced by a deferential soldier. "I won't, sir," he said. And that was it. The pronouncement was over. My father picked up his fork and resumed eating. The moment of connection, if it could be called that, had passed. I felt a familiar, bitter pang of invisibility. To be seen by my father was to be judged. To be invisible was to be worthless. There was no in-between. In my narration, I, the old woman, must add that this was the bedrock of our family's poison. My worth was non-existent, and Jacob's was paramount. My father's ambition required a flawless air, and any blemish, any distraction, would be ruthlessly excised. I was learning, in these silent, terrifying moments, that I was not just a shadow, I was a potential blemish. Later that night, the house settled into a deep, watchful quiet. My room was my only sanctuary. It was small, with a sloped ceiling and a single window that looked out onto the dark, sleeping branches of the oak tree in the backyard. I had painted the walls a pale, watery blue myself, a small act of rebellion that had earned me a week of my father's icy silence. Here, surrounded by my books and the worn stuffed bear I'd had since I was a child, I could almost breathe. I could pretend I was a normal girl in a normal house. I would lie in my bed, the door firmly shut, and lose myself in stories of other worlds, worlds where girls were heroines, where families were kind, where brothers were protectors. It was a fragile peace, but it was all I had. I fell asleep that night with a book on my chest, the words of a better world still clinging to my mind. I don't know what time it was when the sound woke me. It was a sound I knew in my bones, a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to the terror center of my brain. A faint creak. My eyes snapped open. The room was dark, but not completely. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting long, distorted shadows on the floor. I lay perfectly still, my body rigid, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I strained my ears, praying it was just the house settling, a common groan of old wood. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The soft, deliberate creak of the floorboard just outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. I was paralyzed, cocooned in a blanket of sheer terror. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. Slowly, silently, the doorknob began to turn. I watched it, mesmerized by the horror of it. The brass glinted in the sliver of moonlight. There was no sound, just the slow, inexorable motion. It reached its zenith, and then the door began to push inward, a growing slice of darkness against the faint light of the hallway. A silhouette filled the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, instantly recognizable. Jacob. He stood there for a moment, a dark shape against the dim light, letting my eyes adjust, letting me see him, letting me understand that my last sanctuary had been breached. Then, with a quiet deliberation that was more terrifying than any violence, he stepped inside and gently closed the door behind him. The click of the latch settling into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a key turning in the lock of a cage, the sound of my world ending. The fragile peace of my little blue room was shattered forever, and the monster I had spent my life trying to avoid was finally, irrevocably, inside. The world did not stop. That was the first and cruelest lesson. After that night, after the click of the latch had sealed my fate, the sun had the audacity to rise again. It streamed through my little blue window, illuminating the same room, the same books, the same worn stuffed bear. But it was all a lie. The room was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. My body was no longer my own. It was a crime scene. The days that followed blurred into a gray, muted haze. I moved through my life like a sleepwalker, my spirit disconnected from my physical form. I performed my duties, setting the table, clearing the dishes, keeping my room tidy, with a robotic precision that belied the screaming chaos inside my head. The silence in the house, once merely oppressive, now felt predatory. It was filled with the unspoken thing, the sin that had been committed within its walls. It clung to the curtains and settled like dust on the polished furniture. At school, the noise was a physical assault, the clanging of lockers, the chatter and laughter of other students, the shrill ring of the bell. It all felt impossibly loud, a cacophony that grated on my raw nerves. I would walk the crowded hallways with my head down, my books clutched to my chest like a shield. I felt as though the secret was written on my skin, a brand on my forehead that everyone could see. Every whisper seemed to be about me, every laugh directed my way. My grades, once a source of quiet pride, began to slip. I would sit in class, staring at the blackboard, the teacher's voice a meaningless drone. The words on the page of my textbook would swim before my eyes, refusing to form coherent thoughts. Concentration was a luxury I could no longer afford. All my energy was consumed by the simple, exhausting act of holding myself together. Jacob, meanwhile, thrived. The secret that was destroying me seemed to empower him. He moved with a new swagger, an added layer of confidence that was sickening to behold. He was no longer just the golden boy. He was a conqueror. There were no more lingering touches or overt threats. Meh. He didn't need them. The power dynamic had been irrevocably established. All it took was a look. A glance across the dining room table, his eyes locking onto mine for a fraction of a second. A flicker of a smirk at the corner of his mouth before he turned back to our father to discuss his future. That look was enough to make my blood run cold, to remind me of my absolute powerlessness. He knew. And he knew that I would never, ever tell. The unspoken sin was his leash, and he held it tightly. My only tether to the world I had known before was Sarah Jenkins. Sarah, with her fierce loyalty and her eyes that saw too much. She was loud where I was quiet, bold where I was timid. She refused to accept the placid, empty version of myself I presented to the world. She would corner me by my locker, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. "Okay, Emma, this has gone on long enough," she said one Tuesday, her voice low but insistent. The hallway swirled around us, a river of jostling students, but Sarah's focus was a laser beam. "You look like a ghost. You're not eating lunch. You're failing Mrs. Gable's history class. You love history, and you jump every time someone says your name. Talk to me. Is it your dad again? Is he giving you a hard time?" I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the combination lock in my hand. My fingers fumbled with the numbers. "No, it's not him. I'm just tired. I haven't been sleeping well." It was a weak lie, and we both knew it. "Tired doesn't look like this," she pressed, her voice softening. "This looks like scared. You can tell me anything, Em. You know that?" "Your family isn't the only one in the world. Whatever it is, we can face it together." Her kindness was a physical blow. It was a glimpse of a world where secrets could be shared, where burdens could be lightened. A world I no longer had access to. A sob, hot and thick, rose in my throat and I choked it back down. If I started crying, I knew I would never stop. The words she wanted were a toxic sludge trapped in my chest, and to speak them would be to poison everything, including her. "I have to go," I mumbled, finally getting the lock to click open. I grabbed a book without seeing it, slammed the metal door shut, the bang echoing her unspoken frustration. "Emma!" she called after me, but I was already fleeing, pushing my way through the river of students, desperate for a place to hide. The girls' bathroom became my refuge. I would lock myself in a stall and just breathe, my forehead pressed against the cool, painted metal of the door. It was there that the first new symptom began. A wave of nausea would rise from my stomach, sudden and overwhelming, making the room tilt. I would grip the sides of the stall, my knuckles white, and wait for it to pass, my body slick with a cold sweat. At first, I told myself it was the stress, the anxiety manifesting in a physical way. It was a plausible explanation, a lie I could almost believe. But the waves of sickness became a morning ritual. I would wake with a sour, metallic taste in my mouth, my stomach churning. I learned to move silently from my bed to the bathroom down the hall, to retch quietly into the toilet, my body convulsing with heaves that produced nothing but bitter bile. I would splash cold water on my face, staring at the pale, hollowed-out girl in the reflection, and tell her she just had the flu. A lingering, stubborn flu. The fatigue was another lie I told myself. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. It felt as if my very life force was being siphoned away, leaving me a hollowed-out shell. My mother noticed, of course, but in her own detached way. "You look peaked, dear," she'd say, placing a vitamin tablet beside my orange juice at breakfast. "You must be studying too hard." She, like everyone else, chose the most convenient explanation. The idea that something could be truly, fundamentally wrong within the perfect walls of her perfect house was an impossibility she refused to entertain. The days shortened. The leaves on the oak tree outside my window turned from gold to a brittle brown and scattered across the lawn. The cold seeped into the house. And the truth, the one I had been desperately fighting, continued to grow inside me, undeniable and terrifying. My clothes started to feel tight around the waist. I began wearing baggy sweaters, using the changing season as an excuse to hide the subtle changes in my own body. The moment of reckoning came on a gray afternoon in late November. I had come home from school, my body heavy with that now familiar exhaustion. My mother was at her weekly bridge club, Jacob was at practice, and my father was at the hospital. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was truly alone in the house. The silence wasn't predatory. It was just empty. I walked up the stairs to my room, my hand trailing along the banister. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching myself in a movie. I went into my parents' bedroom, a place I rarely entered. It was immaculate, smelling of my father's bay rum aftershave and my mother's lavender sachets. On my mother's side of the large, ornate dresser stood a three-way mirror. It was her one small vanity. I stood before it, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. For weeks, I had avoided my own reflection, catching only fleeting glimpses of my face. I had refused to look, truly look, at myself. But now, in the empty house, there were no more excuses. The time for lies was over. Slowly, I took off my heavy sweater, letting it fall to the floor. I was left in my simple blouse and skirt. I looked at the girl in the mirror, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her. Her face was thin, her skin pale and almost translucent. Dark, bruised-looking circles smudged the space beneath her eyes. But it wasn't her face that held my attention. It was her body. My body. My hands, shaking, came up to rest on my stomach. The fabric of my blouse was pulled taut over a gentle but distinct curve. It was a curve that had not been there 2 months ago. It was subtle, something an outsider might not notice, but to me, it was a mountain. It was the physical manifestation of my shame, my secret made flesh. I closed my eyes, a wave of dizziness washing over me. No, please, no. I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. I'm sick, that's all, it's just swelling. It's my imagination. Then I felt it. It wasn't a kick, not a perceptible movement. It was a flutter, a tiny internal tremor, like the delicate beat of a butterfly's wing, deep within me. It was so faint, I might have missed it if the world hadn't been so deathly quiet, if my entire being hadn't been focused on that single spot. A tiny, impossible flutter. My eyes snapped open. I stared at my reflection, at my hands resting on the gentle swell of my own body. And in that moment, the last vestiges of my denial crumbled into dust. The truth crashed down on me, not like a wave, but like an avalanche, burying me, suffocating me. It was the end of my world. There are moments that cleave a life in two, a before and an after. Before, I was a girl, a sad, quiet, invisible girl, but a girl nonetheless. After, I was something else entirely. I was a vessel for a secret, a walking, breathing testament to my brother's sin and my family's lies. The life inside me, the tiny flutter that should have been a miracle, was my death sentence. It was the proof, it was the cage, and as I stood there, staring at my own haunted reflection in my mother's mirror, the only thought that echoed in the terrifying silence of my mind was, what will my father do to me? The days following my discovery in front of my mother's mirror were a new kind of hell. Before, I had been living with a shapeless, creeping dread. Now, the dread had a name and a form. It had a heartbeat. The secret was no longer just a memory of a violation. It was a living, growing entity, ticking away like a bomb strapped to my soul. The question was no longer if it would detonate, but when. Each morning, the sickness was more violent. I learned to muffle the sounds of my retching with a towel pressed against my mouth, my body convulsing in the cold air of the bathroom. I would stare at my reflection afterward, my face clammy and pale, and see the evidence staring back. The shadows under my eyes were darker, more permanent. My body, which I had once known so well, was becoming a foreign country, its landscape shifting in ways I could not control. I lived in a state of constant, high-alert panic. At the dinner table, I would hold my breath whenever my father's gaze swept in my direction, terrified that his clinical, diagnostic eye would see through my baggy sweater and perceive the truth. I imagined him looking at me and seeing not his daughter, but a symptom, a disorder to be managed. The thought was so terrifying it made it hard to swallow my food. Jacob seemed to sense the shift in me from vague terror to specific certainty. His smug glances became more frequent, more pointed. He was a spider, and I was the fly, tangled in his web, my struggles only serving to alert him to my position. He knew I was trapped. The question that haunted my waking hours and invaded my nightmares was what he would do when my condition became impossible to hide. Would he deny it? Of course. Would he paint me as a liar, as unstable, as promiscuous? Without a doubt. He would feed my father the story he wanted to hear, the story that preserved the golden boy and cast me out as the corrupted one. My desperation grew with each passing day. The thought of telling someone, of breaking the silence, was a constant battle in my mind. Telling Sarah was out of the question. What could she do? In Havenwood, the word of a miller, especially Dr. Richard Miller, was gospel. My story, my accusation against their beloved Jacob, would be seen as a vicious, hysterical lie. I would not only destroy myself, I would pull her down with me. That left my parents. My mind, in its frantic search for an escape, circled back to them again and again, a small, naive part of me, the part that still remembered being a little girl who believed her parents were her protectors, clung to a sliver of hope. Perhaps my mother, seeing my state, would feel a pang of maternal instinct strong enough to overcome her fear of my father. Perhaps my father, for all his coldness, was still a doctor, a man who fixed things. Maybe he could fix this. Maybe they would be angry, disappointed, horrified, but maybe, beneath it all, they would help me. It was a fool's hope, the last resort of a drowning girl, but it was all I had. The decision was made for me. It was a Sunday evening, a week before Christmas. The house was decorated, my mother's pathetic attempt to overlay the family's tension with festive cheer. A string of popcorn and cranberries was draped over the mantelpiece, looking forlorn and out of place. I came down the stairs wearing one of my mother's old, loose-fitting blouses, hoping it would be enough. My father was standing by the fireplace, not looking at the sad decorations, but at me. His gaze was sharp, analytical. He watched me descend, his eyes narrowed. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my torso. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet, yet it cut through the room. "You've put on weight." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a diagnosis. My mother, who was arranging pine boughs in a vase, froze, her hands hovering in midair. The blood drained from my face. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The bomb had been seen. The ticking had become audible to everyone. "My study," he said, turning away from me. "Now." My mother scurried after him, her face a mask of panic. I followed on legs that felt like they were made of cotton, my heart pounding a sick, frantic rhythm against my ribs. My father's study was the heart of the house, the seat of his power. It smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and antiseptic. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, not novels or poetry, but thick medical texts and volumes of philosophy, a library of cold, hard facts. Everything was in its place. A low fire crackled in the hearth, but it offered no warmth, only casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel even more menacing. It was not a place for messy emotions or family crises. It was a place for verdicts. He took his seat behind the large, imposing mahogany desk, folding his hands on the leather blotter. He was the judge upon his bench. My mother did not sit. She stood beside him, slightly behind his chair, as if seeking shelter in his shadow. She was wringing her hands, a nervous, repetitive motion that was the only sign of her distress. I stood before them, on the plush oriental rug in the center of the room, feeling like a defendant in the dock. The desk was a vast, polished barrier between us. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My father just looked at me, his face unreadable, his stillness a terrifying force. He was waiting. He was giving me the opportunity to confess before he was forced to extract the truth himself. My own voice, when it finally came, was a reedy, pathetic whisper. There's something I have to tell you." My father's expression did not change. He simply nodded, a curt, economical movement. "I am aware. I have been for some time. I was merely waiting for you to exhaust your foolish attempts to conceal it." The coldness of his words stole the air from my lungs. He had known. For how long? He had been watching me, observing the symptoms, waiting, not with concern, but with a kind of clinical detachment. like a scientist watching a culture grow in a petri dish. "Whose is it?" he asked. The question was quiet, direct, stripped of all emotion. It was the question of a doctor taking a patient's history. I couldn't speak. The name Jacob was a shard of glass in my throat. How could I say it? How could I utter a truth so monstrous in this room of cold, hard facts? I looked at my mother, a desperate, pleading appeal. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she refused to meet my gaze. She stared at a point on the wall just over my shoulder, her face pale and slack. There was no help there. She had already abandoned me. Tears began to stream down my face, hot and silent. I shook my head, a pathetic, helpless gesture. The truth was too big, too ugly. I was 16 years old, standing before the two people who were supposed to protect me, and I had never felt more alone in my life. My father's lips thinned into a hard, straight line. His patience, what little there was of it, was gone. "I see," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming dangerously soft. "You won't even grant us the dignity of a name. You choose to be a slut and a liar then, to bring some nameless gutter filth into my home." "No," I choked out, the word tearing at my throat. "It's—" Before I could force the name out, before I could utter the accusation that would change everything, the study door opened. Jacob stood there, his face a perfect mask of gentle concern. He was wearing a handsome sweater, his hair perfectly combed. He looked from our father's thunderous face to our mother's terrified one, and finally to me, his eyes full of feigned sympathy. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice full of brotherly warmth. I heard yelling. "Dad, Mom, Emma. Are you okay?" It was a masterful performance. He was the calm, rational one, walking into a scene of female hysterics and paternal anger. He positioned himself as the mediator, the hero. My father's eyes flickered from my tear-streaked, guilty face to Jacob's composed, concerned one. In that single, fleeting moment, I saw the decision being made. I saw him weigh the options. On one side was his daughter, a hysterical, shamed girl carrying a secret. On the other was his son, his heir, the golden boy with a full scholarship and a future that reflected his own glory. It was not a choice between two children. It was a choice between an asset and a liability. The truth was irrelevant. All that mattered was protecting the investment. He had made his choice. His gaze returned to me, and it was as if a steel door had slammed shut behind his eyes. The last flicker of potential fatherly concern was extinguished, replaced by the cold, dispassionate resolve of a surgeon about to perform a necessary, if unpleasant, amputation. "You," he said, his voice a blade of ice, "have brought unspeakable shame upon this family, upon this name, my name." He stood up, placing his hands on the desk, leaning forward slightly. He was no longer just a judge. He was an executioner. "I have spent my life building a reputation of honor and integrity in this town. You will not be the one to destroy what I have built." My world, which had been cracking for months, finally shattered into a million pieces. In that moment, I understood. He never truly wanted to know whose it was. He didn't ask again. He didn't need to. The specifics didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the stain and his need to remove it. In his eyes, I was no longer his daughter. I was a disease that threatened the health of the family unit. I was a cancer to be cut out. And Jacob, with his perfect timing and his concerned face, had just become the surgeon's trusted assistant. He was the cure. The verdict, once delivered, hung in the air of the study, thick and suffocating like smoke. There was no appeal, no discussion. My father had spoken, and his word was law, as immutable as scripture. I was no longer a person. I was a problem, a logistical issue to be solved with quiet, ruthless efficiency. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of my life. My home, the only world I had ever known, transformed into a well-appointed prison. I was a ghost awaiting exorcism. The plan was not explained to me. It was decreed. The day after my confession, my father summoned me to his study again. This time, my mother was not present. He sat behind his desk, a calendar and a small notepad before him. He did not look at me. He looked at his notes, as if I were a patient whose chart he was reviewing. "You will be leaving in 13 days, he began, his voice flat and clinical. "Arrangements have been made for you at a private facility east of the mountains. It is a quiet place where young women in your condition are cared for until the situation is resolved. You will be provided for. You will follow their rules without question. You will not attempt to contact anyone here. You will not speak of your life here to anyone there. Is that understood?" I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. He made a small check mark on his notepad. "Your mother will purchase a suitcase and the necessary items for your stay. You will pack only what is essential. When the time comes, a car will arrive after dark. You will leave without fuss. The official story, should anyone be so indiscreet as to ask, is that you have been sent to live with a sick aunt in California to help care for her. The story is for public consumption only. Within these walls, we will not speak of it, or of you, again after you are gone." Another check mark. He looked up at me then, for the first time, and his eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. "This is a generous solution to a problem of your making. Do not mistake it for forgiveness. You have forfeited that right." And that was it. I was dismissed. I walked out of the study, a 14-day sentence hanging over my head. Life in the house became a living nightmare of silence and avoidance. I was quarantined. My mother, her face a constant mask of strained sorrow and relief, would leave a tray of food outside my bedroom door for breakfast and lunch. She could no longer bear to be in the same room with me, to look at the walking, breathing evidence of the crisis she was too weak to confront. Her avoidance was a constant, screaming accusation. At dinner, the three of them, my father, my mother, and Jacob, would eat in their customary silence, while I would sit with them, a pariah at the feast. They would speak around me, discussing town matters, Jacob's training, the weather, anything and everything except the elephant in the room, the girl whose life was being systematically dismantled before their eyes. Jacob was the worst. He reveled in his victory. He knew the details of my exile. I could see it in his eyes. He would pass me in the hallway and give me a look of mock pity, a slight, sad shake of his head that was for my eyes only, a piece of theater that said, "See what you made them do? See the trouble you've caused?" He was cementing his role as the blameless son, the victim of his sister's shameful downfall. He was gaslighting our entire family and my parents in their desperation to believe him were his willing audience. The air I breathed felt toxic, poisoned with his triumph and my own suffocating shame. My only contact with the outside world, Sarah, was cut off. I heard the phone ring one afternoon, and my mother's clipped, cold voice. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Emma can't come to the phone. She's not feeling well. No, I don't know when she'll be back at school. It's best if you don't call again for a while." I listened from the top of the stairs, my heart withering inside my chest. They were building the walls of my prison higher each day, brick by brick. The day before my departure, my mother left a brand new, cheap-looking cardboard suitcase on my bed. It was a dull, anonymous brown. Inside were a few nightgowns, some plain dresses several sizes too large, and toiletries. It was the trousseau for my banishment. The task of packing was a final, quiet torture. What do you take with you when you are being erased? I moved about my small blue room, touching things as if for the last time. My collection of Nancy Drew novels, their bright yellow spines a cheerful mockery of my situation. The small porcelain music box my grandmother had given me, the one that played a tinny, off-key version of Für Elise, the worn stuffed bear that had absorbed 1,000 childhood tears. These objects were the sum of my 16 years, the physical proof that I had existed, that I had been a child here. But they were part of the before. They had no place in the after. I couldn't take the books. They were too heavy. The music box felt too fragile. In the end, I packed the shapeless dresses my mother had bought, a toothbrush, a comb. I looked at the bear, its button eyes staring at me with a familiar, comforting blankness. With a surge of childish desperation, I stuffed him into the suitcase, his plush body a lump of softness amongst the harsh, new clothes. He was the only piece of my childhood I could not bear to leave behind. I was leaving my home, my school, my name. I would not leave him, too. The final night arrived with a chilling finality. A heavy, wet snow had begun to fall, muffling the world in a blanket of white. It was beautiful and desolate. After a dinner consumed in absolute silence, I was sent to my room to wait. I sat on the edge of my bed, the brown suitcase on the floor beside me, and listened to the sounds of the house. The groan of the pipes, the distant murmur of the television from the living room, the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the last minutes of my life as Emma Miller. At precisely 9 o'clock, I saw the headlights. 2 beams of light cut through the falling snow, swinging into our driveway. A dark, unremarkable sedan came to a stop, its engine a low, idling rumble. It was time. I picked up the suitcase, which felt both pathetically light and impossibly heavy. I took one last look at my room, the sanctuary that had been breached and turned into a holding cell. Then I walked out, closing the door softly behind me, and went downstairs. They were waiting for me in the foyer. My father stood with his back to the door, staring into the darkened living room, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield after the fight was over. My mother was near the coat closet, her own coat already on, her purse clutched in her hands. She came towards me, her face pale and etched with a frantic, selfish grief. She reached out and gave me a quick, furtive hug. It was a brittle, papery embrace, all sharp angles and tension. There was no warmth in it, only the cold desperation of a woman trying to convince herself she was doing the right thing. "Be good, Emma," she whispered, her breath hot and sour with anxiety against my ear. "Do what they say. It's for the best. It really is." Her words were not for me. They were a mantra for herself, a last-ditch effort to absolve her own conscience. I said nothing. I felt nothing. The part of me that could feel love or betrayal or pain had been cauterized, leaving only a numb scar tissue. She pulled away and scurried to the door, opening it to the cold, snowy night. A man I had never seen before, a silhouette in a heavy coat, stood on the porch. He was my escort, my jailer. I walked towards the open door, into the biting wind. As I stepped onto the porch, I didn't look back at my mother. I looked at my father. He still hadn't moved. He hadn't turned around. He would not grant me the dignity of a farewell. I was being erased, and he was bearing witness to the final stroke of the eraser. My gaze traveled from his rigid back up the face of the house, the home that was no longer my home. And then I saw it. In the upstairs window, the one that belonged to Jacob's room, the curtain moved, just a flicker, a slight, almost imperceptible shift in the fabric before it fell back into place. He was there, he was watching, the coward. The victor. He couldn't even face me for the final act of my destruction. He stood hidden in the shadows, a malevolent ghost, observing the successful execution of his plan. The sight of that twitching curtain was a final, intimate violation. It was a reminder that he was the reason for all of this, and he was safe, warm, and untouched, while I was being cast out into the cold and the dark. I turned away, my face numb from the wind, and walked towards the dark car, its engine still rumbling, a mechanical beast waiting to swallow me whole. The anonymous driver took my suitcase and put it in the trunk. I got into the back seat without a word. The door closed, shutting out the sound of the wind and the sight of the house. The car pulled out of the driveway, its tires crunching on the fresh snow. I did not look back. I stared straight ahead through the windshield as the familiar streets of Havenwood, slick and white under the streetlights, slipped by. I saw the town square with its Christmas lights, the darkened storefronts, the homes with wreaths on their doors and warm yellow light glowing in their windows. It was a picture of perfect, peaceful community, a world I had never truly belonged to and one I was now banished from forever. The car picked up speed, heading east, toward the mountains and the darkness, and the girl named Emma Miller began to disappear. The car drove on through the night, a silent, dark vessel carrying its solitary, shameful cargo. I watched the last lights of Havenwood disappear in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the swirling snow and the darkness. The driver, a man whose face I never clearly saw, did not speak a word. The only sounds were the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine. We climbed, leaving the familiar valley behind, ascending into the Cascade Mountains. The landscape became wilder, more desolate. The neat, friendly houses were replaced by walls of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow, crowding the road on either side. It felt like we were driving off the edge of the world. I must have fallen into a state of waking sleep, my mind numb, my body a dead weight against the cold vinyl of the seat. I have no memory of how many hours passed. I was only roused when the car finally slowed, turning off the main road onto a long, unplowed lane. At the end of it, a stark, imposing building rose up against the dark, snowy sky. It was a 3-story structure of dark, weathered brick, its windows narrow and tall like the eyes of a disapproving god. A wrought iron fence topped with cruel-looking spikes surrounded the property. A single, dim yellow light burned over a heavy oak door. A simple wooden sign, barely visible in the weak light, read, "St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls." St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh, a hysterical sound that died in my throat. This was not a place where lost causes were found. This was a place where they were buried. The driver got out, took my pathetic suitcase from the trunk, and left it on the stone steps. He knocked once on the heavy door, a loud, echoing sound in the profound silence of the night. Then, without a backward glance, he got back in the car and drove away, his taillights a receding pair of red eyes, leaving me alone in the freezing cold. The door opened, and a woman stood there. She was a nun, dressed in a severe black habit, her face framed by a stiff white wimple that seemed to pull her skin taut, giving her an expression of perpetual disapproval. A large wooden crucifix hung from a cord around her neck. "You're the Miller girl," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was flat, devoid of welcome or pity. "You're late, come in." "Don't stand there letting the heat out." I stepped inside, into a long, dimly lit hallway that smelled of floor wax, boiled cabbage, and something else. A faint, underlying scent of sorrow. The air was cold, the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones. The floors were polished linoleum, and our footsteps echoed unnervingly as she led me down the corridor. Every wall held a crucifix, the suffering face of Christ, looking down from all angles. She led me to a small, sterile office. Another nun, older and even more severe, sat behind a metal desk. This was Sister Agnes, the head nun, the warden of this place of penance. She had a face like a clenched fist and eyes like chips of granite. "Name," she snapped, without looking up from a ledger on her desk. "Emma Miller," I whispered. "We do not use surnames here," she said, her voice sharp. "It is a vanity. A reminder of the world that has, for now, cast you out. Here, you are Emma, nothing more." "Remove your coat." I did as I was told. The older nun, Sister Agnes, finally looked up, her eyes scanning me from head to toe with a look of frank assessment, like a farmer judging livestock. She saw my still, slender frame, the fear in my eyes, the slight bulge of my stomach that my coat had hidden. "Another one. Lost to foolishness and sin," she sighed, a sound of weary disgust. "Sister Mary will show you the rules. You will follow them. Here, you will work, you will pray, and you will contemplate the shame you have brought upon yourself and your family. This is not a hotel, it is a place of atonement." Sister Mary led me from the office. First, to a small room where I was told to undress. My own clothes were taken from me, folded, and put into a bag, even my shoes. My small brown suitcase was opened, its contents examined. The shapeless dresses were deemed acceptable, the small worn teddy bear was not. "This is a childish affectation," Sister Mary said, holding the bear by one ear as if it were contaminated. "You are not a child anymore. You have engaged in the sins of an adult, and you must put away childish things." "Please," I begged, the first word of protest I had uttered since leaving home. He was my grandmother's. It was a lie, but I was desperate. "Vanity and sentimentality," she sniffed, tossing it into a bin with other confiscated items. A locket, a photograph, a brightly colored scarf. "You will learn discipline here, Emma." I was given the uniform of St. Jude's, a shapeless, scratchy gray dress of a wool-like material, thick brown stockings, and heavy lace-up shoes that felt like blocks of wood on my feet. Dressed in this garb of penitence, I felt the last vestiges of Emma Miller sloughing away. I was one of them now. A gray, anonymous vessel of shame. The days at St. Jude's bled into one another, a monotonous, soul-crushing cycle of labor and prayer. We rose before dawn, woken by a shrill, clanging bell. We knelt for morning prayers on the cold, hard floor of the chapel, our knees aching, our stomachs empty. Breakfast was a bowl of thin, watery oatmeal eaten in complete silence under the watchful eyes of the nuns. Then came the work. Endless, grueling work designed to exhaust our bodies and empty our minds. I was assigned to the laundry. For hours, I stood over steaming tubs of hot water, my hands raw and red, scrubbing sheets and uniforms on a ridged washboard until my back screamed in protest. The air was thick with the smell of lye soap and steam. We were not allowed to speak. The only sounds were the rhythmic scraping of brushes against fabric and the sharp reprimands from the supervising nun if our work was deemed too slow or imperfect. The other girls were like ghosts, moving through their assigned duties with a shared, downcast gaze. There were perhaps 20 of us in total, all in various stages of pregnancy. We were daughters of doctors, lawyers, farmers, and factory workers. Our backgrounds were different, but our sin was the same. We were the secret shame of our families, hidden away until our problem could be born and disposed of. We slept in a long, cold dormitory, our beds narrow cots lined up in 2 rows. At night in the darkness, the silence was often broken by the sound of quiet, muffled sobbing. No one ever acknowledged it. To do so would be to acknowledge our own pain, a luxury we were not afforded. We were isolated together, each of us trapped in her own private hell. I learned their faces, but I never learned their stories. There was a girl with fiery red hair who had a defiant glint in her eye, who would sometimes hum forbidden pop songs under her breath in the laundry until a nun slapped her into silence. There was a younger girl, no older than 14, who seemed to be in a state of catatonic shock, who had to be led from place to place. There was a girl who prayed constantly, her lips always moving in a silent, frantic appeal for a forgiveness that never seemed to come. I observed them all from a distance, a silent ethnographer of sorrow, but I never let them in. My own secret, the secret of who was responsible for my condition, was a wall around my heart. My only hope, the one tiny spark I clung to in the overwhelming darkness, was Sarah. My father had forbidden me to contact anyone, but he could not police my thoughts. The idea of writing to her became an obsession. It was a foolish, dangerous plan. All incoming and outgoing mail was read by Sister Agnes, but I had to try. It was my only connection to the world, my only chance that someone who cared for me might know where I was. I managed to steal a pencil stub from the office, and I tore a blank page from the back of a prayer book in the chapel. One night, long after the final bells, I lay in my cot, a thin blanket pulled over my head, and wrote my desperate plea. By the faint moonlight slanting through the high, barred window, I poured my heart out onto the page. I didn't tell her everything. I couldn't bring myself to write Jacob's name, but I told her where I was. I told her I was scared. I begged her to help me, to tell someone, to do something. I addressed it to her home, my hand shaking so much the letters were jagged and uneven. I ended it with a simple, desperate plea: don't forget me. The next day, with my heart hammering in my chest, I slipped the folded, unsealed letter in with a pile of outgoing mail for the local parish, praying it would go unnoticed. For 2 weeks, I lived on a knife's edge of hope and fear. Every time Sister Agnes walked down the hall, I expected her to stop, to call my name, to hold up my letter as proof of my defiance, but she never did. A tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of my heart. Maybe it had worked. Maybe Sarah had my letter. Maybe right now, she was trying to find a way to help me. The hope was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. I was on my knees, scrubbing the long hallway floor, the smell of bleach sharp in my nostrils. Sister Agnes approached, her footsteps sharp and deliberate. My heart seized. She stopped right in front of me. "Emma," she said. I looked up. She was holding a familiar-looking envelope. My letter. It was still sealed. My stomach plummeted. "This was returned to us," she said, her voice dripping with cold satisfaction. She held it out for me to see. Scrawled across the front in my mother's elegant, looping handwriting were 2 words: return to sender. And beneath that, in my father's sharp, clinical script, a final, damning instruction. Family's request. No further contact. I stared at the envelope, at my parents' handwriting. The words blurred through my tears. They hadn't just sent me away. They had actively, deliberately severed the last tie. They had built a wall around my prison and instructed the world to forget I ever existed. It was a cruelty so profound, so absolute, it stole my breath. It was the final, definitive proof that I was utterly, completely alone. Sister Agnes watched me, a faint, triumphant smile on her thin lips. Your family has entrusted your care and your atonement to us. You would do well to forget the world, as it has clearly forgotten you. Now get back to your work. The floor won't scrub itself. She dropped the letter on the wet floor beside me and walked away. I knelt there for a long time, the water from the bucket soaking through the thin fabric of my dress, my tears dripping onto the mocking words of my own parents. The tiny seed of hope inside me shriveled and died. But in the ashes of that hope, something else began to stir. As the months wore on, as my body swelled with the undeniable life within me, my focus began to shift. The world outside had abandoned me. My family had erased me. The girls around me were lost in their own sorrow. All I had was this secret life growing in the darkness. This child, conceived in violence and shame, was untainted by the Millers. It was not my father's grandchild or Jacob's. It was mine. It was the only thing in the universe that belonged to me. A fierce, primal protectiveness began to form in my heart, a core of hardened steel. I began to eat all of my watery oatmeal, forcing it down to nourish the baby. I began to move through my chores with a deliberate, energy-conserving grace, saving my strength. I was no longer just a victim, a passive recipient of punishment. I was a vessel. A survivor. St. Jude's was meant to break my spirit, but they had failed. They had taken everything from me, and in doing so, they had given me the one thing I needed to go on, a reason to live beyond myself. I would endure this, for the child. I would survive. The seasons turned outside the grim walls of St. Jude's. The last of the autumn leaves were plastered to the ground by winter's first hard frost. Snow fell, deep and silent, burying the world in a pristine white that felt like a mockery of the impurity we were all accused of. Inside, time was measured differently. It was marked by the swelling of our bellies, the increasing ache in our backs, and the slow, one-by-one departure of the other girls. One day, the red-haired girl with the defiant hum was gone. A week later, the young catatonic one was taken away in the middle of the night. Their beds were stripped, their presence erased, leaving only a chilling void and the unspoken question of where they had gone and what had become of their children. The unspoken assumption, the whispered fear in the laundry room, was that the babies were given up, taken by faceless couples, their origins scrubbed clean. We, the mothers, were temporary vessels, our purpose fulfilled the moment the child was born. As my own time drew near, a profound and complex shift occurred within me. The constant grinding labor and the soul-crushing routine had chiseled away at my fear, leaving behind the hard bone of resolve. My focus narrowed to a single point, the life inside me. This child was no longer just a symbol of my shame. It was my companion in this desolate place. I would talk to it in my mind, a silent, one-sided conversation. I would tell it about the color blue, about the sound of Sarah's laugh, about the smell of rain on summer asphalt. Small, fragmented memories of a world it would never know, but proof that such a world had once existed for me. The physical discomfort was immense. My body felt heavy, alien. Sleeping was a struggle. Finding a position that didn't send shooting pains down my back or hips was a nightly battle. Yet through the pain, the connection deepened. When the baby kicked, a powerful, determined thump against my ribs, I would press my hand to the spot, a secret greeting. In this place designed to strip me of all identity, this child was giving me a new one. I was not just Emma, the sinner. I was a mother. The title felt sacred, a secret crown I wore in the darkness of the dormitory. The first contraction hit me in the middle of the night. It was a deep, powerful clench that stole my breath and radiated from the base of my spine. It was nothing like the Braxton Hicks I'd been told about. This was different. This was real. I lay still in my cot, my hand pressed to my swollen belly, and waited. 20 minutes later, another one came, stronger this time. The journey had begun. I did not call for the nuns. I labored in silence for as long as I could, breathing through the waves of pain, hoarding these last hours of connection for myself. It was only when the contractions were coming minutes apart, when a low groan escaped my lips against my will, that the girl in the next cot stirred and whispered into the darkness, "Sister Mary, I think it's Emma's time." The process that followed was swift and clinical. I was moved from the dormitory to the infirmary, a small, cold, white-tiled room at the end of the hall. It smelled sharply of alcohol and bleach. The bed was hard and narrow, covered with a rubber sheet. Sister Mary, her face impassive, helped me out of my gray uniform and into a thin cotton gown. She was efficient, her hands firm, but not unkind. She was the midwife of St. Jude's, a role she performed with the same detached professionalism as scrubbing a floor. The hours that followed were a blur of escalating agony. The pain was a living thing, a red, roaring monster that consumed me. It ripped through my body in relentless waves, leaving me gasping and trembling in its wake. There were no words of comfort, no hand to hold. Sister Mary would check on me periodically, her movements economical, her instructions curt. "Breathe, girl. Don't fight it. It is God's will, the price of Eve's sin." Her words were meant as spiritual guidance, but they felt like a curse. Through the haze of pain, my mind fixated on a single point of light, the child. I was not just enduring this for myself. I was working to bring this new life into the world. The pain was not a punishment. It was a passage. I clung to that thought like a drowning woman clings to a piece of driftwood. After an eternity of struggle, a final guttural scream was torn from my throat, and then a sudden, shocking release. The monster of pain receded, replaced by a profound, echoing emptiness, and into that emptiness came a new sound, the thin, startled cry of a newborn baby. Sister Mary worked quickly, her movements a blur. Then she wrapped the crying, squirming bundle in a clean white blanket and placed it in my arms, and the world fell away. The cold, sterile room, the severe-faced nun, the hours of agony, it all dissolved. All that existed was the small, warm, heavy weight in my arms. I looked down and my breath caught in my chest. A perfect, tiny human being. Her face was wrinkled and red, her eyes squeezed shut. A dusting of fine, dark hair was plastered to her head. I touched her cheek with one finger, my hand trembling. Her skin was impossibly soft. She smelled of blood and life and something else, something uniquely her own. She stopped crying and made a small, snuffling sound, her tiny mouth rooting against the blanket. A wave of love so powerful, so absolute, washed over me, cleansing me of all the shame and fear and pain. It was a force of nature, a love that defied logic and circumstance. This perfect creature was mine. She was the product of violence, but she herself was pure innocence. She was born in a prison, but she was freedom. "I'll call you Hope," I whispered, the name coming to me unbidden, a prayer on my lips. My daughter, Hope. I held her close, burying my face in the blanket, inhaling her scent. For that one perfect, timeless moment in that cold, sterile room, I was not a lost cause. I was a mother, holding the entire world in my arms. The next morning, I awoke from a shallow, exhausted sleep to find Sister Agnes standing over my bed. Beside her stood a man I had never seen before. He was in his 50s, with a kind, round face, spectacles, and clean, manicured hands. He wore a tweed jacket and carried a leather doctor's bag. He looked completely out of place at St. Jude's. Hope was no longer in the bassinet beside my bed. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice raspy. "Where is my baby?" Sister Agnes made a small gesture to the man, who stepped forward. His kind face was arranged in an expression of solemn pity. "My dear child," he began, his voice soft and sorrowful. "I am Dr. Alastair Finch. Sister Agnes called me in during the night." There were complications. The knot in my stomach turned to ice. Complications? What complications? She was fine. She was perfect. Newborns can be very fragile, the doctor continued, his voice oozing a practiced, gentle sympathy. Her lungs were not fully developed. She was very weak. We did everything we could, of course, but she was just not strong enough for this world. The room began to tilt. The white tiles on the wall swam before my eyes. "No," I whispered. "No, you're lying." Sister Agnes placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "The Lord has taken her home, Emma," she said, her voice filled with a false piety that made my skin crawl. "She was a pure, innocent soul, and God has called her to be with the angels, away from the sorrows of this world. You must see it as a blessing." "A mercy." "No!" The word was a raw, animal sound, torn from the deepest part of my soul. "You're lying! Where is she?" "I want to see my baby. I want my baby." I tried to get out of bed, to push past them, but my body was weak, leaden. The doctor quickly produced a syringe from his bag. "She's hysterical," he said calmly to Sister Agnes. "A little something to calm her nerves." I felt a sharp prick in my arm. I tried to fight, but a warm, heavy fog began to roll through my mind, my limbs becoming thick and unresponsive. My screams turned to choked sobs, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was Sister Agnes's triumphant, pitiless face. When I awoke again, hours later, the doctor was gone. Sister Agnes was sitting in a chair by my bed, reading from her Bible. On the bedside table was a glass of water and a single, folded piece of paper. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, without a trace of sorrow in her voice. "This is the official death certificate for your records. It will provide closure." My hands shaking, I reached for the document. It was a crisp, official-looking form. In neat typed letters, it listed the name of the deceased as Baby Girl Miller, cause of death, respiratory failure due to pulmonary insufficiency. It was signed by one Dr. Alistair Finch. It was all there, in black and white. A clean, administrative lie to erase a human life. They thought this piece of paper would give me closure. They thought the sedatives and the platitudes would break me. And they were right. I broke. The grief was a physical thing, a jagged hole ripped through the center of my being. The screams that came from me in the days that followed were not human. They were the sound of a soul being flayed alive. But my captors, in their perfect, calculated cruelty, had made a miscalculation. They gave me a death certificate for a fake death. It was the perfect crime. They hadn't just stolen my child, they had stolen my grief, twisting it into a weapon to ensure my silence and my submission. They thought the break would be final, but they were wrong. Like a bone that is shattered, I did not simply heal. In the darkness and silence of my grief, I began to set myself in a new way, a harder way. The soft, frightened girl named Emma Miller had died in that infirmary. The woman who began to emerge from the wreckage was someone else entirely, someone forged in the fires of the most profound betrayal, someone who now had nothing left to lose, and someone who would one day make them pay for their lie. The woman who walked out of St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls was not the same one who had arrived 6 months earlier. The girl had been broken by shame. The woman who left was hollowed out by grief, a walking sepulcher for a child she had held for only a few precious hours. They released me 2 weeks after Hope's departure. My body had recovered, as Sister Agnes put it, and there was no longer any reason for me to take up a bed. They gave me back the bag containing my old clothes, a bus ticket to a city 100 miles away where I knew no one, and $20. There was no farewell. I was simply discharged, another piece of human refuse scrubbed clean and disposed of by their system. I never went back to Havenwood. To return would have been to accept their narrative, to become the sick aunt in California, a living ghost in their carefully constructed lie. Instead, I went to the city the bus ticket sent me to, and I let Emma Miller die. It was a quiet, unceremonious death. With my $20, I bought a new dress from a secondhand store and a meal that tasted like ash in my mouth. I found work as a cleaner in a boarding house, scrubbing other people's floors and toilets, my hands becoming permanently raw, a familiar penance. I was quiet, I worked hard, and I was invisible. Skills I had perfected long ago. In my spare time, I went to the library and learned how to acquire new documents. It was easier then. A new town, a new story. I became Anna Peterson, a plain name for a plain woman, an orphan with no family and no past. I met George 2 years later. He was a mailman, a man of simple routines and profound kindness. He had a gentle smile and sad eyes that seemed to understand that I, too, was carrying some deep, unspoken sorrow. He never pushed. He never prodded me about my lack of family or my reluctance to speak of my childhood. He simply accepted the quiet, wounded woman I was. He saw my emptiness, and instead of trying to fill it, he built a safe, warm space around it. We married, and for 45 years we lived a life of quiet contentment. We had a small house with a garden where I grew tomatoes and zinnias. He delivered the mail. I worked part-time at the local library. We had no children. In the early years, he had wanted them, but I had refused, a deep, visceral rejection that I could never explain to him. How could I bring another child into a world when I believed my own body was a place of death? He accepted my decision, as he accepted everything about me, with a quiet, loving resignation. He thought it was because I feared I couldn't carry a child to term. He never knew the truth, that I could not bear the thought of replacing the one who had been taken from me. He was a good man. Our life together was my anesthetic. The quiet routine, his steady presence, the simple domesticity, it all served to dull the sharp edges of my grief. The wound was still there, a cold, hard knot in the center of my being, but life with George was a thick, warm bandage that covered it. I loved him for that bandage. I loved him for the 45 years of peace he had unknowingly provided, and then, last year, he died. A sudden heart attack, swift and merciful, the doctor said. The bandage was ripped away, and in the year of silence and solitude that followed, the old wound began to ache with a new and terrifying intensity, which brought me to today. Sitting in the middle of the living room floor of the small house George and I had shared, surrounded by cardboard boxes, I'd finally sold the house. The closing was next week. I was moving into the Chestnut Ridge facility, a place for old women like me, a final, tidy chapter. My task today was to perform the last rites for our shared life, to sort through the boxes of George's things, to decide what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away. It was a melancholy task. I folded his old flannel shirts, still faintly smelling of him, of sawdust and Old Spice. I looked through photo albums filled with pictures of a smiling woman named Anna Peterson, standing next to a kind-looking man, on vacation at the Grand Canyon, at a neighbor's barbecue in our garden. I looked like a happy woman. I had played the part well. In the back of his closet, behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines, was a small metal lockbox. It was old and slightly rusted. I didn't recognize it. George had never been a man for secrets or hidden boxes. Curiosity piqued. I found the small key on his keychain, the one whose purpose I had never known. It fit. With a small grating click, the lock opened. The air that escaped smelled of old paper and my own forgotten past. My breath caught in my chest. Inside was not George's history, but mine. A small, sad collection of relics from the life of Emma Miller, things I had not seen or touched in 60 years. I had thought I'd thrown them away in a fit of desperate reinvention decades ago, but George must have found them, packed them away and kept them, another quiet, loving act of preserving the woman he knew was fractured. My trembling fingers lifted them out, one by one. There was the returned letter. The envelope was yellowed and brittle, my mother's elegant handwriting and my father's sharp clinical script still terrifyingly clear. Return to sender. Family's request. Holding it was like touching a live wire. The humiliation, the absolute desolation of that moment on the floor of St. Jude's came rushing back. Beneath it was the death certificate, that crisp official lie. Baby girl Miller. Cause of death, respiratory failure. I traced the typed words with my finger. This piece of paper had defined my entire adult life. It was the source of my sorrow, the reason for my childless marriage, the foundation of the quiet, grieving woman George had fallen in love with. It was the linchpin of my 45-year lie. I should have closed the box then. I should have thrown these cursed objects into an incinerator and let the ashes scatter to the wind. But there was one more thing, tucked into a side pocket of the lid. It was another envelope, newer than the letter to Sarah. It was a long, white business envelope, and it was sealed. The return address was that of a law firm in a town I didn't recognize, but it was the name on the front that made the air leave my lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. It was not addressed to Anna Peterson. It was addressed to Miss Emma Miller. My name. My real name, mailed to this house. How? When? I looked at the postmark. It was dated 30 years ago. My mind reeled. 30 years ago, George and I had been living here for over a decade. This letter had arrived, and I had never seen it. The realization was a slow, dawning horror. George, gentle, kind George. He had gotten the mail that day, as he always did. He had seen the name, a name he would have only known from the old, sad stories I had vaguely alluded to in our early years. He must have opened the lockbox, found the relics, and understood. And he had made a decision. He had seen this letter, this ghost from a past I had tried so hard to escape, and he had hidden it. He had buried it in this box with the other painful memories, thinking he was protecting me. He was sparing his quiet, wounded wife from having an old scar ripped open. It was an act born not of malice, but of a profound, misguided love. But he hadn't protected me. He had preserved the lie. He had kept me chained to a false grief for 3 more decades. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold the envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The ghost that had been whispering to me for the past year was about to speak. With a ragged tear, I ripped open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. It was a letter from a lawyer, an executor of an estate. Dear Miss Miller, I am writing to you as the executor of the last will and testament of my client, Mrs. Carol Donovan, née Gable, who passed away last month, Mrs. Donovan was, for many years, a nurse at the St. Jude's home near. My eyes scanned the page, my mind struggling to keep up. The nurse. A name I'd never known. The letter went on to explain that the nurse, as part of a final deathbed confession, had been tormented by her role in a number of illicit activities at the home. Her will had allocated funds and instructions for her lawyer to attempt to contact the mothers of the children whose records had been falsified. She had left behind a sworn affidavit, a sort of penance. I read on, my world beginning to tilt on its axis. The affidavit details a number of private, off-the-books adoptions, arranged for significant sums of money paid by the biological fathers or their families. In these cases, the mothers were often told their children had died shortly after birth, and fraudulent death certificates were issued to close the matter permanently. My blood ran cold. The words on the page began to swim. I forced myself to focus on the final paragraph. According to Nurse Donovan's sworn statement in private records, your child, a female infant born on April 12th, did not, in fact, expire. She was healthy. The records show she was placed in a private adoption arranged and financed in full by a doctor. Richard Miller of Havenwood, Oregon. The letter fell from my hand. The room, the boxes, the fading afternoon light. It all dissolved into a meaningless blur. The scream that rose in my throat was silent, a soundless agony that ripped through my entire being. My child was alive, my hope. The grief I had carried for 60 years, a heavy, cold stone in my heart, shattered. But what replaced it was not relief. It was a cataclysm, 60 years. For 60 years, I had mourned a ghost. For 60 years, my daughter had been alive, somewhere in the world, while I lived out my quiet half-life, believing she was dust. The lie. It was not just that they had told me she was dead. The lie was my entire life. My marriage to George, my identity as Anna Peterson, the very sorrow that had defined me. It was all built on a foundation of their monstrous, calculated deception. They hadn't just stolen my daughter. They had stolen my life. I sat there on the floor amidst the wreckage of my past, and the hollowed-out woman, the grieving mother, the quiet widow, began to crumble away. And from the ruins, something new and terrifying began to emerge. Not the hardness of a bone that had set, but the cold, clear, terrifying focus of a woman who had just been handed a map, a weapon, and a reason to burn the whole world down. My father, my brother, they were still out there. And my daughter? My daughter was alive. The ghost I needed to find was not the ghost of a dead baby. It was the living ghost of a stolen child. And the hunt was about to begin. The silence in the room after the letter fell from my hand was different. The quiet of my life with George had been a soft, padded thing, a sound-dampening blanket of routine. The silence of my year of widowhood had been a hollow, echoing void. This new silence was electric. It was the charged, humming stillness before a lightning strike. It was the silence of a mind that had been shattered and was now reassembling itself, piece by piece, into a new and dangerous shape. I did not scream. I did not weep. The time for tears was over, a luxury afforded to a woman who believed her sorrow was legitimate. The woman I was becoming had no time for such indulgences. I sat on the floor for a long, still moment, the letter lying beside me like a serpent's shed skin. The grief I had carried for my dead daughter was a clean, pure thing, a sacred burden. The emotion that now flooded me was a filthy, complex poison. 60 years of rage at a crime I never knew had been committed. 60 years of regret for a life I had not lived, and a terrifying, razor-sharp sliver of hope that felt more dangerous than any despair I had ever known. Slowly, methodically, I began to move. The boxes of George's life, which had seemed so poignant just minutes before, were now just clutter, obstacles. I pushed them aside. I stood up, my old bones protesting, but my mind was clear and sharp. The fog of age and sorrow had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. My first act was to collect the evidence. I picked up the lawyer's letter, the fake death certificate, and the returned letter to Sarah. I held the 3 documents in my hand, the lie, the proof of the lie, and the proof of their cruelty. I went to the kitchen, found a large manila envelope, and sealed them inside. This was my arsenal. My mind, a machine that had been idling for decades, was now racing. What now? The lawyer's letter was 30 years old. The nurse was dead. The law firm might not even exist anymore. I was an 80-year-old woman with a small pension and a house that was no longer mine. What could I do? The answer came to me with an immediate and absolute certainty. Sarah. Sarah Jenkins, my only friend, the girl who had tried to save me. The girl my family had built a wall against. The returned letter in my hand was no longer a symbol of my isolation. It was a beacon. It was proof that once, someone had been on my side. If she was still alive, she was the only person in the world who would believe me, the only one who had a personal stake, however small, in the crimes of the Miller family. But how do you find someone after 60 years? The world had changed. I, who had lived a life of deliberate obscurity, was an analog soul in a digital age. The next morning, I did not go to the senior center for my usual coffee clutch. I walked to the public library, a place where I had once worked, a place I still understood. The young librarian, a girl with kind eyes and purple hair, showed me to the public computer terminals. I felt a tremor of anxiety looking at the glowing screen, the keyboard, the mouse. It was the language of a world I had let pass me by. I need to find an old friend, I told her, my voice steadier than I felt. She showed me how to use the search engines. I started with the basics. Sarah Jenkins, Havenwood, Oregon. The results were a confusing jumble. An obituary for a Sarah Ann Jenkins who died in 1998. My heart seized until I saw the birth year was wrong. A social media profile for a teenager who looked just like the girl I remembered. A jarring glimpse into the cycles of life. I refined my search. I remembered Sarah had been smart, ambitious. She'd wanted to be a writer. I typed, Sarah Jenkins, journalist. The screen filled with links. Articles, bylines, interviews, my breath hitched. It was her. The articles spanned decades, hard-hitting investigative pieces, interviews with politicians, exposés on corporate corruption. She had become exactly who she was meant to be. I found a professional biography on an old newspaper's website. It said she was retired but still contributed occasionally to online journals. It listed her as residing in Portland. I had found her, but finding her name on a screen and reaching out across a 60-year chasm of silence were two different things. It took me another day to build up the courage. I found a contact email address on one of her more recent articles. I sat in the library for an hour, staring at a blank message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could I possibly say? Hello, it's Emma Miller, the ghost from your childhood. My life has been a lie, and I need your help to burn it all down. In the end, I kept it simple, my words as stark and direct as my new state of mind. Subject: a voice from Havenwood. Dear Ms. Jenkins, my name is Emma Miller. We were friends a lifetime ago in Havenwood. I have a story I believe you, and only you, will understand. It is a matter of the utmost urgency. I am in possession of documents that pertain to us both. If you are willing, I would like to meet with you. Sincerely, Emma. I clicked send before I could lose my nerve. The rest of the day was an agony of waiting. I went back to the house and continued to pack, my movements mechanical, my mind elsewhere. Every time my phone buzzed with a junk email, my heart leaped. I was beginning to think she had ignored it, deleted it as the ramblings of a strange old woman, when a reply finally came, late that night. Subject: a voice from Havenwood. Emma, my God, I haven't heard that name in 60 years. Yes, I will meet you. Tomorrow? 10 a.m., the Roasted Bean coffee shop on Morrison Street. I'll be the old woman with the ridiculously large glasses. Sarah. The next morning, I took a bus to Portland. The city was a noisy, bustling beast, a world away from my quiet life. The Roasted Bean was a trendy place filled with young people typing on laptops, the air thick with the smell of dark coffee and baked goods. I saw her immediately. She was sitting at a small table by the window. Her hair was a stylish, short-cropped silver, and just as she'd promised, she wore a pair of large, fashionable black-rimmed glasses. She looked sharp, intelligent, and formidable. As I approached, she looked up, and her professional, appraising gaze softened. The years fell away, and for a fleeting second, I saw the 16-year-old girl with the bright, inquisitive eyes. Emma? She said, her voice a little shaky. Sarah, I replied. We didn't hug. We were two old women, strangers to each other's lives, bound only by a distant, painful memory. I sat down opposite her, placing the manila envelope on the table between us. You look, she started, then trailed off, unsure of what to say. It's been a long time. 64 years, I said, my voice flat. A waitress came to take our order. The mundane interruption felt surreal. We ordered coffee, two old friends catching up, a perfect picture of normalcy. When the waitress left, Sarah leaned forward, her journalistic instincts taking over. Your email, she said, her voice low. It mentioned documents pertaining to us both. What did you mean by that? Instead of answering, I opened the envelope. I took out the first piece of paper and slid it across the table. It was the letter I had written to her from St. Jude's, the one she had never received. She picked it up, her brow furrowed. She looked at the childish, desperate handwriting, then at the envelope, at the familiar looping script of my mother's hand. Return to sender, she read aloud, her voice filled with a sudden, sharp anger. Family's request. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror and a 60-year-old anger. My God, Emma. I wrote to you. I called your house. Your mother told my parents you were unstable. That you'd been sent away for your own good. She said any contact would be harmful. My parents forbade me from trying again. All these years, I thought you just disappeared. I thought you didn't want to be found. They built a wall, I said simply. The coffee arrived. We sat in silence until the waitress left. Then, I pushed the second document across the table, the fake death certificate. Sarah read it, her face paling. Baby girl Miller, she whispered. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a profound, sorrowful pity. Oh, Emma, I am so sorry. Don't be, I said, my voice hard. It's a lie. I gave her the final letter, the one from the lawyer. I watched her face as she read. I saw the pity turn to confusion, then to disbelief, and finally to a pure, unadulterated journalistic rage. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the paper. She finished reading and slowly, carefully, placed the letter back on the table. She looked at me, and the friendly old woman was gone. In her place was the investigative reporter, the one who toppled corrupt politicians. "That son of a bitch," she breathed, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "Richard, Jacob. Your mother, all of them. It wasn't enough to abuse you and exile you. They had to invent a dead child to torture you with for the rest of your life. It's monstrous." This was the moment. The validation. The first time my truth had been heard and believed without question. A single, hot tear, the first I had shed since George's funeral, escaped my eye and traced a path down my wrinkled cheek. I wiped it away impatiently. "I need to find her, Sarah," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "My daughter. She's out there. She's in her 60s now. I need to find her before I die." "And then what?" Sarah asked, her gaze sharp, analytical. "And then," I said, my voice turning to ice, "I need to go back to Havenwood." Sarah stared at me for a long moment. She saw the grief, the hope, the 60 years of pain, but she also saw the cold, burning fire in my eyes. She saw the woman I had become. A slow, grim smile spread across her face. "You won't be going alone," she said, her voice filled with a steely resolve. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her grip was firm, strong. "They buried this story for 60 years. Well, I've made a career out of digging up graves." She leaned back in her chair, a new energy radiating from her. "Let's go wake up some ghosts." The coffee shop felt like a world away, a dream from another life. The reality was Sarah's apartment in Portland, which had become our command center, our war room. It was nothing like my small, quiet house. Bookshelves overflowed onto the floor, stacks of newspapers and files covered every available surface, and a large corkboard, previously covered in what looked like notes for a political thriller, had been wiped clean. In the center of it, Sarah had pinned the 3 documents from my manila envelope: the lie, the proof of the lie, and the proof of their cruelty. They formed a small unholy trinity, the focal point of our new shared existence. The 60 years of passivity that had defined my life as Anna Peterson had been burned away, leaving behind the focused, determined core of Emma Miller. And that core had found its perfect counterpart in Sarah Jenkins. Watching her work was like watching a master craftsman. The grief and shock she had shown in the coffee shop had been quickly supplanted by a cold, professional fury. She was a hunter, and the ghosts of my past were her prey. "Okay, Emma," she said, on that first evening, pacing in front of the corkboard with a mug of black coffee in her hand. "The lawyer's letter is our Rosetta Stone, but it's 30 years old. The lawyer, William Doss, is likely retired or dead. The firm may have been absorbed or dissolved. The nurse, Carol Donovan, is dead, so we don't start there. That's the treasure chest. First, we have to find the map." Her starting point was St. Jude's. While I made us sandwiches, my hands moving with a purpose they hadn't felt in years, Sarah was on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that amazed me. She wasn't just searching, she was excavating. She navigated obscure county archives, digitized church records, and property deeds. "Here we go," she muttered after an hour. She turned the screen towards me. A black and white photo showed a grim brick building, instantly recognizable. St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls. Operated by the Sisters of Perpetual Penance from 1948 until 1973, when it was shut down by the state for substandard living conditions and insufficient medical care. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Substandard was a gentle word for it. "The order was disbanded in the 80s, Sarah continued, scrolling rapidly. "The property was sold to a developer. It's a gated community now called Pine Ridge Estates. God, the irony." For the next few days, we fell into a routine. Sarah would work the phones and the computer, calling on old contacts, pulling strings, using a network of favors built over a 40-year career. She spoke in a kind of code, a language of journalistic inquiry that was both polite and relentless. I became the keeper of the story, the archivist. I wrote down everything I could remember about St. Jude's, the names of the other girls I could recall, the layout of the building, the daily schedule. Every detail, no matter how small, was a potential clue. We hit our first wall quickly. The adoption records for that county from that era were sealed. Ironclad. Without a court order, which we had no grounds to get, or the consent of all parties, which was impossible, there was no way in. They knew what they were doing, Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration after a long, fruitless call with the county clerk. Men like your father. They used the system of shame to their advantage. They created a fortress of sealed documents and societal taboos to hide their crimes. Doubt began to creep in, a cold, familiar tendril. I looked at the corkboard, at the evidence of my past. Was this all a fool's errand? Was I an old woman chasing a ghost, destined only to stir up my own pain? Sarah must have seen the flicker of despair in my eyes. She put her hand on my arm, her grip firm. "Don't you dare, Emma," she said, her voice fierce. We knew this wouldn't be easy. A locked door is just a puzzle. We have the key. We just have to find the right way to use it. The key was the nurse's letter. We shifted our focus to the lawyer, William Doss, and his firm. After 2 days of digging through online Bar Association archives and old phone directories, Sarah found it. The firm, Doss Kilpatrick, had been bought out by a larger Portland firm in the late 90s. Doss himself had passed away a decade ago. It felt like another dead end. "No," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming. "It's not. When a firm is acquired, they acquire everything, including the archives. Old client files, estate records. They're legally required to keep them for a certain number of years. It's a long shot, but they might still have the Donovan estate files in deep storage." The next morning, Sarah put on a smart blazer and her most formidable pair of glasses. She was no longer just my friend. She was Sarah Jenkins, esteemed journalist, a name that still opened doors. We went to the gleaming downtown office of the corporate law firm. While I waited, a small gray ghost in their plush leather waiting room, Sarah went into battle. She was in there for over 2 hours. I watched the clock on the wall, my anxiety a tight knot in my stomach. Finally, she emerged, a thin file folder in her hand and a look of grim triumph on her face. "The managing partner is an old source of mine," she said as we walked to the elevator. I may have implied this was for a major story on historical abuses in faith-based institutions. He was very cooperative. She opened the file. Inside was a copy of the nurse's sworn affidavit, a more detailed version of what the letter had summarized. And stapled to the back was a single sheet of paper from the nurse's private records. It was a list of names and dates. My hands shook as I took it from her. My eyes scanned the list, and there it was, April 12th. Baby girl Miller. And next to it, 2 other names. Adoptive parents, Paul and Eleanor Bishop. And then the name given to the child, Alexandra. Alexandra. The name was a bell, ringing in a chamber of my heart that had been silent for 60 years, Alexandra. I said it aloud, a whisper. Alexandra. My daughter had a name. The rest of the search felt different. It was no longer a hunt for a ghost, but for a person. Alexandra Bishop. The name was our North Star. Back at Sarah's apartment, the search became feverish. Public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses. We traced the Bishops from Oregon to California and then to Arizona, where Paul, an engineer, had taken a job. We found their obituaries. Eleanor Bishop had died 15 years ago. Paul, just 7 years ago. They had been good people, by all accounts. Active in their church, beloved by their neighbors. The obituary for Eleanor mentioned her only cherished child, her daughter, Alex. Alex, not Alexandra. Alex. "She's an architect," Sarah breathed, pointing to the screen. A.M. Bishop. Head of her own firm in Phoenix, specializes in sustainable design. There are articles about her. Awards. She clicked a link. An article from an architecture magazine appeared. And there, at the top of the page, was a photograph. Time stopped. the world narrowed to the glowing rectangle of the screen. It was a professional headshot. A woman in her early 60s, with intelligent, confident eyes, a warm, intelligent smile, and short, stylishly cut dark hair, now streaked with gray. She was beautiful. She was successful. She looked happy. I leaned closer, my face inches from the screen, tracing the lines of her face with my eyes. She had her adoptive father's strong jawline, but her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, that was mine. From the faded photographs of a young Anna Peterson, I saw the echo of my own joy. And her eyes. They were a familiar shade of blue. Not my blue, my father's. A cold shiver went down my spine. The legacy he had been so desperate to protect was staring back at me from the face of the granddaughter he had discarded. I didn't realize I was crying until Sarah put a gentle hand on my shoulder. They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a strange, painful, overwhelming joy. She was real. My hope. My Alexandra. My Alex. She was real, and she was magnificent. The thrill of discovery soon gave way to a new and even more terrifying challenge. We had found her. Now what? We had the power to shatter this woman's world, to upend the very foundation of her identity. The responsibility was crushing. "We have to be so careful, Emma," Sarah said, her voice gentle. All the journalistic fire banked for a moment. "This is her life. We can't just storm in." I knew she was right. For 2 days I sat with a pad of paper and a pen, trying to write the letter. Every attempt felt wrong. Too blunt, too emotional, too demanding. How do you tell a stranger that her entire life is a lie? How do you introduce yourself as the mother who, in her mind, never existed? Finally, I realized I could not ask for anything. I could not demand a reunion. I could not even ask for forgiveness. All I could do was offer the truth and let her decide what to do with it. My final version was short, factual, and written from the deepest, most honest part of my soul. I wrote about a scared 16-year-old girl named Emma. I wrote about a place called St. Jude's and a baby born on a cold April night, a baby she had named Hope. I did not mention the abuse. I did not mention Jacob. That was a story for another time, if there ever was another time. This letter was not about my pain. It was about her existence. "I was told you died," I wrote. "I have grieved for you for 64 years. I only learned the truth a few weeks ago. I understand that this news must be a profound shock, and I do not know what your life has been. I hope it has been happy. I am not asking for anything. I only felt that you had a right to know the truth of your own beginning. The choice of what to do with this truth, if anything, is entirely yours." I enclosed copies of the 3 key documents, the nurse's affidavit, the fake death certificate, and the picture of me at 16, the haunted girl from the family portrait. I wanted her to see the face of the mother she never knew. We put it all in a priority mail envelope with tracking so we would know when it arrived. The act of dropping it into the mailbox at the post office felt momentous, an irrevocable act. I had launched a message in a bottle across an ocean of time. The power was no longer mine. It was in the hands of a successful architect in Phoenix, a woman named Alex, my daughter. The 2 days that followed were the longest of my life. Sarah and I checked the tracking number relentlessly. We watched the letter's journey from Portland to Phoenix. We saw the status change to out for delivery. And finally, that afternoon, the word we had been waiting for. Delivered. It was done. The arrow had been fired. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a woman was holding a letter that would either be dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman or would change her life forever. Sarah made tea. We sat in her living room, the corkboard now feeling like a monument to a finished campaign. But the war wasn't over. It had just entered a new, terrifyingly quiet phase. We sat in silence, 2 old women, waiting for a phone that might never ring. The silence that followed the delivery of the letter was the most profound of my life. It was a silence filled with infinite possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Sarah and I existed in a state of suspended animation. We made meals we barely tasted, read books whose words made no impression, and watched the clock on the wall. its ticking a slow, agonizing torture. Every time the phone rang, we would both jump, our hearts leaping into our throats, only for it to be a telemarketer or a wrong number. With each passing day, my carefully constructed resolve began to fray. What had I done? I had taken a hand grenade, pulled the pin, and mailed it into the heart of a stranger's life. A woman who, by all accounts, was happy and successful. What if she read the letter and threw it away, dismissing it as a cruel prank or the ravings of a lunatic? What if she believed it and it destroyed her? What if she hated me for bringing this chaos into her ordered world? The hope that had burned so brightly now felt like a dangerous, consuming fire. "We can't just sit here, Emma," Sarah said on the third day of silence. She couldn't stand inaction. It was against her nature. "Waiting is poison. We need to move to prepare. Let's assume the best, that she believes you and wants to know more. But let's also work on the other front. Let's see what our old friends in Havenwood are up to." While I sat numbly by the phone, Sarah returned to her laptop, her journalistic instincts, a comforting, familiar hum in the tense apartment. She began to dig into the current lives of the Millers. My mother, Eleanor, had passed away a decade after I left, a quiet death from what the obituary called a long illness, which I knew was likely a euphemism for a spirit that had finally given up. My father, the great Dr. Richard Miller, had lived to a ripe old age, passing away just 2 years ago. He had died a titan of the community, lauded for his contributions to medicine and his unimpeachable character. The hypocrisy made me sick to my stomach. And Jacob. My brother was still alive, in his early 80s now. He had followed in my father's footsteps, becoming a doctor, though not a surgeon, a family physician. He had taken over my father's practice, inherited the house on Sycamore Lane, and become the keeper of the Miller legacy. He was a town elder, a respected figure, a man whose name was synonymous with Havenwood itself. It was Sarah who found the announcement, buried on the town's community website. Her sharp intake of breath made me look up from my vigil by the phone. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," she said, her voice a low growl. She turned the screen to face me. The announcement was for a civic ceremony to be held in 2 weeks' time. The town of Havenwood was dedicating a new wing of the local hospital, the hospital where my father had reigned for 40 years. The banner on the web page showed a smiling, benevolent picture of my father. Below it, the text read, "Join us for the dedication of the Dr. Richard Miller Memorial Wing for Pediatric Care." The world swam before my eyes. A pediatric wing, a monument to his care for children, built on the foundations of a stolen child and a ruined childhood. The audacity, the sheer monumental hypocrisy of it, was breathtaking. "Jacob is the guest of honor," Sarah read, her voice dripping with venom. "He will be giving the keynote address on his father's lifetime of service." This was it. The universe, in its own cruel and poetic way, was providing us with a stage. It was the perfect public platform, a ceremony dedicated to celebrating the very lie that had defined my life. It was too perfect to ignore. My quest was no longer just about finding my daughter. It was now about dismantling a fraudulent legacy. It was later that night that the phone finally rang. The caller ID was a number from Arizona. My heart stopped. Sarah and I looked at each other, a silent, shared moment of terror and hope. I picked up the receiver, my hand trembling so badly I could barely hold it. "Hello?" I said, my voice a dry whisper. "Hello," a woman's voice replied. It was hesitant, cautious. "Am I speaking with Emma Miller?" "Yes," I breathed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, the sound of a life taking place hundreds of miles away. "My name is Alex Bishop," she said finally. I received your letter." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone for support. Sarah stood beside me, her hand hovering near my shoulder. "I don't know what to say," Alex continued, her voice thick with a confusion that mirrored my own. "I've read the documents 100 times. My parents, the people who raised me, they were wonderful. They always told me I was adopted. They said my birth mother was a very young girl who loved me but couldn't keep me. They said she died not long after I was born. Another one of their lies." A kinder one, perhaps, designed to protect the adoptive parents and the child, but a lie nonetheless. "I am not dead," I said softly. "No," she whispered. "Apparently not." I heard her take a shaky breath. "The photograph you sent, the girl. I have a picture of my mother, Eleanor Bishop, from around the same time. You look so much alike. It's uncanny." "I need you to know," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "I never wanted to give you up. I would have died for you." "They told me you were the one who had died." "The death certificate," she said, her voice now holding a note of hard-edged anger that sounded unnervingly familiar. "It was the Miller Steel. I took your letter to a friend of mine, a lawyer. He said it looks real, but that it wouldn't be hard for a man with Dr. Miller's influence at the time to have one falsified, especially at a private institution." She paused again. I always felt adrift. Loved, but with no history, no anchor. Now I feel like I'm in the middle of an earthquake. We talked for over an hour. It was a strange, delicate dance of questions and answers. I told her about St. Jude's, about the coldness of the place, about the joy I felt when I held her. I did not tell her about Jacob. I did not tell her about the violence. I answered her questions honestly, my voice low and steady. I was not the grieving mother. I was a witness, giving a statement, offering her the facts of her own life. It was Alex who brought up Havenwood. "This man," she said, her voice hardening again. "Dr. Richard Miller, my biological grandfather, the man who bought me, sold me, and sentenced my mother to a lifetime of grief. He's my history, isn't he? He's my anchor." "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Don't be," she said, her voice fierce. "I'm not. I'm furious." Then I told her about the ceremony. I told her about the pediatric wing and Jacob's keynote address. For a long time, the only sound on the line was her quiet, angry breathing. "When is it?" she asked finally. "In 10 days, I said. Another long silence. Then, "I'm booking a flight to Portland." The week that followed was a blur of methodical planning. Alex arrived, and meeting her in person was an experience my mind could barely process. She was tall, poised, and radiated an intelligence and strength that filled me with a fierce pride. We met at Sarah's apartment, and the three of us, the mother who was stolen from, the daughter who was stolen, and the friend who was lied to, formed a council of war. We were 3 women, from 3 different generations, united by one family's crimes. Alex, it turned out, had inherited not only my father's eyes but Sarah's tenacity. She was not a victim in this. She was an investigator. She wanted every detail, every piece of the truth. Together, we planned our return to Havenwood. It would not be a quiet, furtive visit. It would be an invasion. On the day of the ceremony, Sarah drove us. Returning to Havenwood was like stepping into a dream. The town was superficially the same. The familiar town square, the old movie theater, the pristine houses, but it felt different, smaller, like a model village from my past. The memories were everywhere, ghosts on every corner. But I was not the haunted girl who had fled in the back of a dark car. I was returning with an army. The dedication was being held on the great lawn in front of the town hall. A large crowd had gathered, the elite of Havenwood, dressed in their Sunday best. A large banner with my father's smiling, benevolent face hung above a temporary stage. The atmosphere was one of self-congratulatory reverence. We arrived as Jacob was taking the stage. He was stooped now, his hair thin and white, but he still carried himself with that familiar, arrogant air. He adjusted the microphone, his eyes scanning the crowd of admirers, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice raspier with age, but still carrying the smooth, practiced cadence I remembered so well. "We are here today to honor a great man. A man of science, a man of integrity, a man of the community. My father, Dr. Richard Miller, believed in one thing above all else, protecting the future. And what is the future, if not our children?" I felt Alex stiffen beside me. Sarah put a calming hand on her arm. We stood at the back of the crowd, shielded by an old oak tree, waiting. Jacob's speech was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. He spoke of my father's gentle bedside manner, his tireless dedication, his unimpeachable character. The crowd nodded along, their faces shining with admiration for the myth they had all bought into. When he finished, the applause was loud and long. He held up his hands, basking in it. This was his moment. The culmination of a lifetime of lies, and that's when I began to walk. I emerged from the shadow of the oak tree, a small, frail-looking old woman in a simple coat. I moved slowly, deliberately through the crowd. A murmur started at the back and rippled forward as people turned to look. The older ones, the ones who remembered, their eyes widened in recognition. The ghost of Emma Miller had returned. On the stage, Jacob's smile faltered. His eyes locked on me, and for the first time in his life, I saw true, naked fear on his face. The color drained from his cheeks. "And now," the mayor was saying, "if Dr. Jacob Miller would do us the honor of cutting the ribbon." "You speak of honor, Jacob?" My voice was not loud, but it was clear and cold, and it carried across the sudden silence of the lawn. All heads swiveled towards me. Jacob stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Security," he stammered into the microphone, his composure shattering. "Please, my sister is unwell. She has been for a very long time." I kept walking, my gaze locked on his. I was halfway to the stage now, the crowd parting before me like the Red Sea. "I am not unwell, Jacob," I said, my voice gaining strength with every step. "I am simply remembering. I remember a father who was so obsessed with his good name that he bought a fake death certificate for his own grandchild." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not part of the program. "And I remember a brother," I continued, my voice now ringing with 60 years of repressed fury. "A golden boy, a hero, who crept into his 16-year-old sister's room at night." The silence was absolute, broken only by a few horrified whispers. Jacob was ashen, clutching the podium for support. "Lies," he finally shrieked, his voice cracking. "She's a delusional old woman. She's always been a liar." I had reached the foot of the stage. I looked up at him, at the pathetic, crumbling ruin of the man who had ruined me. "Am I?" I asked softly. "You took my child from me. You let me believe she was dead for 64 years, but you made a mistake. You can't kill hope." And on that cue, as Sarah and I had planned, a figure stepped out from the edge of the crowd. Alex. She walked calmly, confidently, and stood beside me. She was tall, poised, the very picture of success and integrity. And her face, with my father's eyes and my smile, was an undeniable testament to the truth. She took my hand. The crowd stared, speechless. They looked from my brother's terrified, guilty face to my determined one, and then to the strong, beautiful stranger who stood with me. Alex looked not at the crowd, but directly at the crumbling man on the stage. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear, strong, and utterly devastating. "My name is Alex," she said, "and this woman, Emma Miller, is my mother." The myth of the Miller family did not just crack, it exploded. In the stunned, horrified silence of the good people of Havenwood, on the stage built to celebrate his father's lies, Jacob's world, his reputation, and his entire life turned to dust. The world, for a single frozen moment, held its breath. The lawn of Havenwood's town hall, filled with the town's most respected citizens, was utterly silent. My daughter's words, clear and indisputable, hung in the cold autumn air. "This woman, Emma Miller, is my mother." Then the silence shattered. It wasn't a single sound, but 1,000 tiny ones at once. A collective, horrified gasp, the frantic clicking of a local reporter's camera. A rising tide of whispers that spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. On the stage, the mayor's face was a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. My brother, Jacob, swayed on his feet, his face the color of ash. He stared at Alex, his eyes wide with the terror of a man seeing a ghost, a living, breathing ghost that had just demolished his world. Before the chaos could fully erupt, Sarah's hand was on my arm. "Now," she said, her voice a low, urgent command. We go now. She was right. Our work here was done. We had lit the fuse. We did not need to stay for the explosion. Sarah, a seasoned pro at navigating chaotic scenes, forged a path. I held tightly to Alex's hand, a connection that was both brand new and 60 years old. We moved as one, a phalanx of truth cutting through the stunned, parting crowd. No one tried to stop us. They just stared, their faces a mixture of confusion, horror, and a dawning, sickening comprehension. The last thing I saw as we reached Sarah's car was Jacob, my brother, my tormentor, slumping forward over the podium, a broken old man on the ruins of a stage built to honor a lie. We did not speak on the drive back to Portland. There were no words big enough. I sat in the back seat with Alex, our hands still clasped. I watched the familiar haunted landmarks of Havenwood recede until they were gone for good. It was not an escape this time. It was a liberation. The explosion we had left behind was, according to Sarah's gleeful reports over the next few days, spectacular. She, of course, had contacts everywhere, and her phone began ringing before we were even out of Havenwood's town limits. The story was a supernova in their small, quiet universe. The first casualty was the front page of the Havenwood Chronicle. The headline, in a bold, accusatory font, screamed, "Miller Legacy in Ruins After Shocking Public Accusation." The article, written by the same young reporter whose camera had been clicking so frantically, detailed the entire, horrifying scene. It quoted my words and Alex's. It described Jacob's collapse, the mayor's hasty cancellation of the rest of the ceremony, and the stunned, silent dispersal of the crowd. The story was picked up by larger papers in Portland and Salem. Suddenly, my father was not a local hero. He was the subject of a statewide scandal. Sarah, with a grim satisfaction, read excerpts aloud to us. A dark secret at the heart of Havenwood's most prominent family. Allegations of abuse and a 60-year cover-up. The surprise appearance of a daughter long believed dead has raised disturbing questions about the late doctor. Richard Miller's celebrated career. Jacob, the new patriarch, became a pariah overnight. The house on Sycamore Lane, once a symbol of prestige, was now besieged. Local news vans parked on the pristine curb. Reporters knocked on the door, shouting questions through the mail slot. We saw photographs of him, a stooped, haunted figure, peering through the curtains, the same curtains he had hidden behind 64 years ago to watch my exile. The symmetry was not lost on me. He had made his home a prison of observation. Now it was his own. He issued a single weak statement through a lawyer, calling the accusations the tragic, unfounded ramblings of a disturbed and estranged family member. But no one believed him. The sight of Alex, so poised, so successful, so undeniably a Miller, had been more powerful than any denial. The public fallout was swift. The hospital board convened an emergency session. My father's name, once their proudest emblem, was now a source of deep institutional shame. 2 days after the ceremony, a crane was brought in. A small crowd gathered to watch as workmen in hard hats unbolted the large metal letters from the new pediatric wing, the doctor. Richard Miller Memorial Wing. I saw a photo of it online, the sign being lowered to the ground, a monument to a lie being dismantled. Justice, it turned out, could be quiet, methodical, and wonderfully mundane. Amidst the public storm, the three of us existed in the quiet eye of it, in the sanctuary of Sarah's apartment. The days were strange, suspended in time. We would sit and drink tea, read the news reports, and talk. Not about the horror, but about the 60 years we had lost. Alex, my daughter, was a stranger, and I was ravenous for the details of her life. She told me about her parents, the bishops, about their kindness and their love. She told me about her passion for architecture, for creating spaces that were beautiful and sustainable. She was everything I could have ever hoped for, intelligent, compassionate, and strong. I think, she said to me one afternoon, her voice thoughtful, that in some way my parents knew. They knew my story was more complicated than the one they were told. There was always a sadness they couldn't quite reach. When I was a teenager, I found my adoption papers. There were inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. When I asked them, they became very quiet. They told me the past was painful and it was better to look forward. I think they were trying to protect me from a truth they suspected but could never prove. Sarah, for her part, was in her element. She was no longer just my friend. She was a chronicler, documenting the fall of the House of Miller with a professional zeal that was both terrifying and magnificent. But one evening, after a particularly satisfying phone call confirming that Jacob had been asked to step down from the hospital's board of trustees, she turned to me, her expression soft. "Was it worth it, Emma?" she asked. "All this, the noise, the pain." I thought about it for a long moment. I thought of the whispering crowds, of Jacob's ruined face, of the headlines. It was a whirlwind of destruction. "Revenge is not sweet, Sarah," I said, the words coming to me with a surprising clarity. "It's not a hot, satisfying meal. It's just quiet." And it was true. The feeling inside me wasn't triumph, it was silence. It was the end of a 60-year-old scream that had been trapped in my throat. It was the feeling of a weight so immense, so constant, that I had not realized I was carrying it until it was gone. I didn't do it for the pleasure of seeing Jacob fall. I did it for the 16-year-old girl who was never allowed to speak. I did it so she could finally be at peace. A week after the ceremony, there was a knock on the door of Sarah's apartment. We weren't expecting anyone. Sarah looked through the peephole, her body stiffening. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered. She looked at me. "It's him. It's Jacob." A cold dread, a phantom limb of my old fear twitched inside me, but it was quickly replaced by a calm, icy resolve. Alex stood up, ready to intervene, but I shook my head. "Let him in, Sarah," I said. "I want to see him." The man who shuffled into the apartment was not the golden boy, not the predator, not the pillar of the community. He was just a pathetic, broken old man. His eyes were red-rimmed and baggy, his hands shook, and he seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive coat. He stood in the entryway, looking at the three of us, his gaze finally settling on me. "Emma," he croaked, his voice a dry rustle. "Jacob," I replied, my voice even. "What do you want?" he asked, a pathetic whine in his voice. "Is this it? Have you enjoyed it? Destroying everything my father, our father, built." "Destroying me?" "What your father built was a lie," I said, my voice as cold and hard as a gravestone. "He built it on my body and my silence. You were his willing architect. You have not been destroyed. You are simply, for the first time in your life, living with a sliver of the consequences of your own actions." He took a shuffling step forward. "Please," he begged, and the sight of him, so utterly broken, pleading, filled me with nothing but a vast, empty contempt. "Make it stop. Tell the papers it was a misunderstanding, a mistake." I looked at this man, the source of all my life's pain, and I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a profound and complete indifference. He was a ghost to me now, a relic of a past that no longer had any power. "A mistake?" I said, my voice quiet. I gestured to Alex, who stood beside me, a silent, powerful indictment. "My daughter is not a mistake. My life was not a mistake." "What you did, what you are, Jacob, was not a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to be a monster. And now you must live in the ruins you created. Get out of my friend's home." He stared at me, searching my face for some flicker of the scared little sister he could always control, and he found nothing. He saw a stranger, a woman made of iron and ice. He turned then, without another word, and shuffled out the door, a man completely and irrevocably defeated. As the door closed behind him, I knew I would never see him again. The final ghost of Havenwood had been exorcised. The torrent of news reports and public shame eventually slowed to a trickle. The world, having devoured the scandal of Havenwood's most prominent family, moved on to the next sensation. For us, however, in the quiet sanctuary of Sarah's apartment, the world was just beginning. The quiet that descended was not the silence of dread or waiting, but the calm, clean silence after a 60-year storm has finally passed. The path forward was unwritten, a blank page. For the first time in my life, I had no script to follow. I was not the invisible daughter, the shamed girl, the grieving mother, or the avenging ghost. I was just Emma, and I was sitting in a sunlit living room with my daughter. Getting to know Alex was a strange and delicate process. We were two strangers bound by the most intimate of connections. There was an initial awkwardness, a careful dance around the raw, gaping hole of our shared history. We couldn't start with, "Do you remember when?" like other mothers and daughters. Our shared past was a crime scene, so we started with the present. I learned that she loved the stark beauty of the desert where she lived. I learned that she was a brilliant architect who could speak with passionate intensity about the play of light in a building. I learned that she had a dry wit and a laugh that started deep in her chest. She learned that I liked my tea with lemon, that I had a quiet love for mystery novels, and that I had been married for 45 years to a good, kind man named George. Telling her about George was one of the hardest parts. It felt like a betrayal of them both, of George, because my life with him was built on a lie, and of Alex because my grief for her had prevented me from ever giving him the family he wanted. One afternoon, Alex pulled out a photo album. It was filled with pictures of her life. Alex as a baby with her adoptive mother, Eleanor Bishop, a woman with a kind, open face. Alex on her first day of school, missing her 2 front teeth. Alex graduating from college, her arm around her adoptive father, Paul, both of them beaming with pride. I looked at these images of a happy, loved childhood, and I felt a strange and painful mix of gratitude and envy. Gratitude that she had been given this, and a profound, aching envy that I had not been the one to give it to her. "They were wonderful," she said softly, watching my face as I traced a picture of her mother. "They loved me fiercely. But they were sad for me, I think. They knew my beginning was a painful one, and they did everything they could to build a world of safety for me." She looked up at me, her gaze direct and full of a wisdom that went beyond her years. "They gave me my life, Emma." "You gave me my existence. Both are true. One doesn't cancel out the other." In that moment, a piece of the guilt I hadn't even known I was carrying, guilt that another woman had raised my child, simply dissolved. Alex, with her quiet strength, had given me a gift. She had made space for everyone in her story. The unspoken truth, the violent origin of her existence, was a shadow between us. I did not know how to broach it, how to apologize for a crime in which I was the primary victim. It was Alex, once again, who built the bridge. We were walking in a park near Sarah's apartment, the autumn air crisp and clean. The leaves were a riot of red and gold. It was the first time I had truly noticed the beauty of a season in over a year. "The man," she said suddenly, not looking at me, her eyes on the path ahead. "Your brother, Jacob. He's my biological father, isn't he?" The question was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. "Yes," I whispered. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. "I thought so. There's a darkness there, in the story." I could feel it. She turned to face me, and her eyes, my father's eyes, were filled with a deep and terrible sorrow, not for herself, but for me. "The things he did to you, that is not your shame, Emma. It's his. And the fact that I exist because of it, that's not your shame either. It's just a fact, a terrible, tragic fact. But it's not the fact that defines either of us." She reached out and took my hand. "I am not the product of his violence," she said, her voice fierce with conviction. "I am the product of your survival." And with those words, the last and darkest ghost was banished. She had looked into the abyss of her own origin story and refused to be claimed by it. She had claimed herself. And she had claimed me, not as a source of shame, but as a source of strength. The day before Alex was to fly back to Phoenix and I was to move into my new, quiet apartment, we took one last walk. The future was uncertain. We were not a normal mother and daughter. We would likely never be. We had years of phone calls and visits ahead of us to build something new, but it was a beginning. A real one. As we sat on a park bench, I reached into my purse. My fingers closed around the old, faded photograph of the Miller family, which I had carried with me like a talisman of my pain. I pulled it out. For the first time, I could look at it without flinching. I saw my father, Richard, a man so consumed by the idea of legacy that he had destroyed his own family to protect it. I saw my mother, Eleanor, a woman so terrified that her weakness became its own form of cruelty. I saw my brother Jacob, a monster disguised as a golden boy, and I saw her. The scared 16-year-old girl in the back, the ghost I had been for so long. "I am so sorry," I whispered to the girl in the photograph. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back for you." Then, with a deliberation that felt as momentous as any act I had ever committed, I tore the photograph in half. The ripping sound was loud and satisfying in the quiet air. I separated the frightened girl from the family that had imprisoned her. I looked at the larger piece in my hand, at the 3 faces of my tormentors. They looked small now, pathetic and powerless. They were just faded figures on a piece of aging paper. I let the scrap fall from my fingers. It fluttered for a moment before landing in a trash can beside the bench. I had finally thrown them away. I was left holding the small, torn portion with the image of the young, terrified Emma. I looked at her haunted eyes, and I slipped her carefully into my coat pocket, keeping her close. I had rescued her at last. Alex watched me, her expression unreadable but full of a deep understanding. She put her arm around my shoulder, and we sat there for a long time, watching the world go by. My father shamed me. My brother broke me. The world forgot me. They built my life into a prison of grief and lies, and they thought they had buried me in it, but they made one mistake. The most crucial mistake of all. They let me live, and a life, no matter how broken, can learn to heal. A voice, no matter how long it has been silenced, can learn to speak again. A heart, no matter how deep the wound, can find a way to let in the light. It is not about forgetting the past or erasing the scars. It is about choosing to build a future alongside them. Walking away from the bench, with Alex's arm steadying my own, I felt the sun on my face. It was a beginning. It was not the life I had lost, but it was a life nonetheless, a life of my own making, and for the first time in 64 years, it was a life filled with a quiet, gentle, and resilient hope.